Welcome to the Board of Behavioral Sciences Policy and Advocacy Committee meeting. Today is February 8, 2019. The time now is 9:02 a.m., and we're in the Department of Consumer Affairs hearing room in Sacramento, California. So for this time, I will have Christina to help us establish a quorum.
Morning. Christina Wong,
Here.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach,
Here.
Betty Conley,
Here.
Jonathan Maddox.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and do introduction. Let's see. I'll start with maybe Steve on that side.
Steve Sodergren, Board of Behavioral Sciences.
Jonathan Maddox, LMFT board member.
Kim Madsen, Executive Officer for BBS.
Christina Wong, LCSW member.
Sabina Knight, Legal Counsel.
Christine Whitlisbach, Public Member.
Betty Conley, LEP member.
Roseanne Helms, Legislative Analyst for the Board.
Christy Berger, Regulatory Analyst for the Board.
Thank you very much. So for the public, if you're willing and your introduction is voluntary, so please come up to the podium and introduce your name and your organization that you represent.
Family Wong, National Association.
Good thing he has a good projection.
Hi, good morning. Angela Blanchard on behalf of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists.
Thank you very much. So the next agenda item is to approve the committee meeting minutes. So the first one is August 24th, 2018. Any comments from the board members? Okay. Public comments? Okay. So I think we need a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll move to approve.
I'll second it. So Christina?
Okay, roll call vote. Jonathan Maddox.
Yes.
Christina Wong.
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach.
Yes.
Betty Conley.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you very much. So the second agenda, no, actually the second minutes, committee meeting minutes is the one on October 19, 2018. So board members, any comments? Public comments? Okay, we're ready for a motion. Okay, I'll move to approve the committee meeting minutes of October 19, 2018.
I second that.
Jonathan second, and Christina, we're ready for a vote.
Okay. Jonathan Maddox.
Yes.
Christina Wong.
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach.
Abstain. Wasn't here.
Thank you. Betty Conley.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. So the next agenda item is the update to the informational brochure regarding therapist sexual behavior and sexual conduct. And it's Roseanne.
Okay, so this agenda item is basically some follow-up work to implement a bill that Board of Psychology sponsored and was signed into law in September. And the bill was AB 2968, and it basically requires the Psychology Board, the Board of Behavioral Sciences, the Medical Board, and the Osteopathic Medical Board to work together to update the content of the Professional Therapy Never Includes Sex brochure. That's the brochure that certain professionals are required to give to a patient if they believe that that patient had previous sexual contact with a previous therapist. So a couple of things that the brochure did. It included LEPs in the list of professionals that are included in people who must distribute the brochure in certain circumstances. And it also includes a new definition of sexual behavior, kind of to update for technology changes over the years. It had gotten kind of out of date. So the Board of Psychology has drafted some language that you see in Attachment A. This is proposed language that their board has considered, and they are asking this board, they're going to ask this board and the medical board and osteopathic medical board for feedback before they come up with the final version. So we can open it up for discussion.
So now we're basically giving inputs and so that, we can come up, for the final version. So
Right.
board members, any comments? I actually have.
Just very quickly.
Yeah,
We are
go
the
ahead,
last
Kim.
board to take a look at this language. The Med Board, the Psych Board, and osteopath and other various boards have all looked at it. Dr. Leah Brew and Jonathan Maddox sat on the working committee to develop the language, and I think that some of the language is very consistent with the recommendations that they made during that working session. Any of the new revisions, I believe, are coming directly from input from the board members. I believe it's psychology board, some wordsmithing. So.
Yeah.
Is this intended just to be for mental health therapists? Is this?
Well, that's what the bill addresses, and that's what we are mandated to do. Although I agree it could be applicable to other professions.
Right, particularly the nature of some
Yes.
therapist work.
Yeah.
Okay, that was already discussed.
But that was,
okay.
yeah, there's a legislation that mandates that DCA with specific healing art boards
Yeah.
create this brochure.
Okay.
So, and we're just updating it.
As long as it was thought about and talked
Yes.
about.
So I do have a couple of just quick suggestion. So I believe it's the line 2019, 219. So that's page 22 in our board packet and page 6. So it's intimidation or intimidated. Because when we're talking about feelings, so it's the feeling of intimidated. Because, the next word is threatened. So I think the more appropriate word would be intimidated instead of intimidation. So that's one. The other thing is, I think it's about just the matter of consistency. So the line 373, which is page 9 on the brochure and page 25 on the packet, and it used the word records. So it's referring to the patient's records. And then if you go back a few pages, on page 21 and on our packet and the page 5 on the brochure, line 170 and line 174, and that says file. So I think we need to be a little bit more consistent. So I think the record, it's probably, to me, it's a little more appropriate, instead of using the file. I mean, file is a very old term. So, I think that the record, would probably, be a little bit clearer and also more public friendly. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments? Steve?
I have one. In the line 10, where we say California lawmakers, licensing boards, and ethical therapists want the public to know.
The ethical ones.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe the wording should just say California lawmakers and licensing boards want the public to know, because it's kind of presupposing that we want to make sure all therapists should be ethical. So it just sounded really weird to me. So I would recommend possibly striking that ethical therapists out, since it's us that wants them to know. And then the last thing is on the very end. We probably need to coordinate with psychology and stuff. There was about requesting the pamphlet. There's I think we need to look at that, because it doesn't match up with what we currently have out there with the publications, DCA publications and such. So we'll want to look at that.
Are you talking about the very last page?
Very last page, where you can get copies of this brochure, because we say you can go to the website at DCA, and we offer 4 free copies, but then after that, I guess DCA can charge. So I'll show you one.
Okay.
So that was the 2 things I had.
So the content really looked great. So, yeah. So, board members, any other tweaking, wordsmithing, public comments?
Hello, good morning. Angela Blanchard on behalf of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. We are very supportive of the language as drafted. Did want to raise a point to you, however, it came to our attention that obviously trainees are not included in this language, and from a consumer protection standpoint, we recognize that the boards do not have direct authority over the trainees, but is there a space for us to include some language so that consumers understand that they too have protections for those that are under a trainee's circumstance? Again, just putting it out there for your consideration from a consumer protection standpoint. Thank you.
So that would include the MFT and also the LPCC trainees.
Right, but the trainees are there associates are there, but the trainees are under the auspice of the school.
Oh, yeah, the trainees covered.
Under licensed psychologists.
Yes, so, but that's, needs to be a separate category. So under trainee of the MFT license and the trainee, yeah, they're not in there.
No, the trainees aren't, because the
They aren't
board,
registered, they're students.
they're students, and so even if we got a complaint on a trainee, there's nothing we could do.
I think that there is merit to that. If you look at page 35 of your packet, under the definition, where this is the code section where it's talking about the brochure and the
Oh, they do
requirements to
include it.
They include they include under the very top of the page, there is under item N, a clinical counselor trainee, and a marriage and family therapist trainee is item number H. So there's no reference to social work interns there, but they do reference trainees. So I think we could reference those, the MFT trainees and the PCC trainees.
Right.
So I think we could request that be
could.
included.
Do we want to add it to the definition of terms?
I think that would be clearer, right? I mean, if that's a possibility.
Add what to the definition of?
Oh,
Trainees?
the trainees, yeah,
Yeah.
into the brochure.
Yep.
But I guess the question for me leads to, if we add that to the definition, what is the impending consequence for a trainee that engages in such behavior? Is the board going to keep records of this so that when they eventually apply for their associate registration, that's something that could be considered? Or are we just informing them because really the board has no sort of way to sort of implement a consequence if they are reported? So what's the next logical step for us as a board that we should consider?
But it's also about consumer protection and also about educating the public about the trainee are also covered. So not, I think, it's about, educating about, what the appropriate behavior. And then I think the board can take, action down the road. Because I can also see that the trainee, the next step is, they're going to apply for their licensing. And if they have a complaint, and I think that gives the board, some good information to take actions.
Well, I think it might be interesting if we're going to add them, to add that, typically a trainee works through the school, that they either need to file a complaint with the school or file a complaint with where they're receiving services. Because there's nothing we can do.
Right.
At the moment.
Right, but I can't imagine any school where
Yes.
that occurred, that the trainee gets to stay enrolled and then continues on, graduates, and then they show up at our doorstep. I would think that would be a clear invitation to find a new career.
Absolutely. I think there are for me, is twofold. One is about, the consumer protection. The other is about, the disciplinary issue. And
Right.
so I think the consumer protection, we need education and I think the brochure itself, will cover that. And yet, how the discipline action, I think when a trainee comes in, they have that mechanism in school and then down the road, the professional, the professional licensing organization. So I think I think it's good. It's a good thing
What, to add them?
to add it.
But
Sorry. Adding them to this,
brochure.
Roseanne, let me know if I'm misinterpreting this, but this laundry list in the bill is including them in the people who have to provide this brochure also to those people who have disclosed sexual conduct from a previous therapist.
Right.
Okay, right. So that's just, so it's including the trainees, it's including the associates. So this list of people are mandated to provide this brochure to clients or patients who have disclosed, oh, my last therapist sent me a text of a private body part or some other sexual conduct that's defined in here, right? Is that correct? Right. So that's how the trainees will be brought into this loop type of thing, of course. I'm not I just want to make sure there's a clear line between what enforcement might happen with their own conduct versus what this brochure is doing.
Actually, yeah, and actually in 728, that's the way that it's defined. It's defined twice and they're included twice. So
Where are you? Seven?
on page 35, where it's, there's a list of the people that have to comply with giving out the brochure and discuss it. And then in 728, which goes over to page 36, there's another list. Yeah. So they're in both places.
So I have a question. So does that mean, so let's say a consumer files a complaint against a registered associate about behavior when they were a trainee, can the board at that point investigate it and then bring about some consequence?
I don't think so, because at the time that action occurred, they weren't under our jurisdiction. It's retro.
Okay.
Unless there's a conviction or something along those lines. If there's some kind of action, then we could.
Okay.
That might be interesting, yeah.
Then I guess the other question I have is too, is if someone files an active report against a trainee, would it make sense to add to the brochure some paragraph or something that talks about this is your recourse for a student who's currently in their academic program. You could actually talk to the supervisor at the agency, or you could follow up with their academic program to file a complaint there. I mean, because to just tell them that a trainee has to give them the brochure seems to be only a partial remedy. We'd want them to know that they can actually pursue this at the academic institution and the agency where the student is training.
I think we can make that suggestion, yeah.
Okay. Any feedback about, the brochure? Okay. Jenny?
Janley Wong, NASW. I'd be concerned that if trainees are handing out this brochure to the public assumes that the BBS regulates trainees. And so if a public member gets a brochure from a trainee and decides that the trainee's conduct was inappropriate, sexual, the first place they're going to probably call is the Board of Behavioral Sciences.
Right.
So I feel like this is not good for consumers, because the next thing you'll do is say, we don't regulate these people, call the school or something like that. So that's a disservice to the public if they have to go, because remember, they're probably traumatized by the behavior and they're needing help, and then they're sent into like a telephone loop or something like that.
But we are also talking about, handing out this brochure and then going through with them. And so the brochure really is a means. It's an informational brosure. Yeah.
But I think Janley raises an interesting
No,
point.
it's a really interesting point, yeah.
I think it would help if we added them to the list on page 19 and then put like a footnote that trainees are not yet under the jurisdiction of the board for disciplinary action or for concerns about these. You would need to contact either the organization where they are working or their academic institution.
Right. I think that's how it, and that's clean. It's not a lot of big substance, so I don't think that it would delay publication of the brochure.
Easy to do, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So I think that section can be added probably after the Board of Psychology and Medical Board, Osteopathic Medical Board, and then, talk about the trainee, to contact the school.
She was saying to add a footnote.
Yeah,
As a footnote,
Yeah.
so when we say definition of terms,
Here, and
Yes.
asterisk it and then add a footnote or
Right.
something, yeah.
so I thought that, I was just recommending us,
Yeah.
to consider another alternative place to make it cleaner also, because then you can have that whole list of stuff and contact the school for the trainees.
So which page were you suggesting that, Christina?
Page 8. Because that's what, when we're talking about what you can do.
Could we consider adding them on what it would be page 3 in the list of people? And then footnote it there?
That's what Roseanne was talking about, so I was just throwing out another option.
Okay.
We could
Yeah.
footnote it maybe in both places, or is that overkill?
That might be overkill. Just my 2 cents.
Either way is fine. I'm just thinking that, for it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
As far as that information is in, but I was just thinking about, which place is cleaner.
Yeah, and the
Okay.
group might, when you guys go back, and the other group might have other ideas too.
Yeah.
So just so long as that information gets in there, you guys are good with
I
that.
think so, yeah.
Okay. No matter how it does.
It doesn't matter, the location.
Yeah.
Okay.
Janley?
Janley Wong, NASW. Another consideration is that typically in agency settings, a client or consumer will actually want to speak to the individual supervisor.
Yep.
And that's actually the best. If you think that if this individual, the trainee, is acting inappropriately with one client, the trainee may be acting inappropriately with multiple clients. So by going to the supervisor first, you're trying to shortcut that behavior right away versus sending the consumer to the school. The consumer might feel like, well, I'm going to go to the school first because that's what the brochure tells me, and I'm not going to go to the supervisor.
Okay.
We can list the supervisor as another option.
Yeah, so we'll list the supervisor, the agency where they're working, or the academic institution.
Absolutely.
And I think it would be helpful to define what trainee is. That's this individual enrolled in school, not yet licensed.
Okay.
So in that sense, should we include, say, like the social work, MSW social work intern? I think that probably should be included.
What's that?
The MSW interns.
You want to include them too? Okay.
Yeah, I think a trainee or intern.
And maybe rather than putting not yet licensed, I mean, we might want to consider putting has not yet received their graduate degree.
Oh,
Because that's even before that. They haven't even received
That's
their
true.
degree. So they're not licensed. It probably is irrelevant. They haven't even received their degree, so.
I'm good with that.
That's good. Yeah. Yes, Christy?
On page 4, lines 130 through 132, therapy includes any type of counseling from any of the licensed or registered professionals listed above. So that might need to be tweaked a little bit.
Where are you?
Page 4, starting with line 130. So it says that they're licensed or registered, so that might need to be a little clarification there, since we're adding
Okay.
trainees.
Right. So it looks like we might have to, get some little
We'll have
fine combing and. get
Yeah,
the thing-
I'll go through the brochure and I'll kind of come up with a red line to send to psychology, and then we'll see what they say, and then we'll probably, if we get it back in time for the board meeting, we'll bring it back one more time, if that's possible.
Perfect. All right. Any other discussion? Not too early for some wordsmithing, huh? Wake everybody up. So looks like we're ready for a motion. So what would be the motion? We don't need a motion?
No, staff's going to go back and work with the board with your recommendations.
Okay. So, all right, we do not need a motion. So, wonderful. So in that sense, let's proceed to the next agenda item, which is about adding new LMFT degree title. And it's Roseanne again.
Okay, this is an item that was already, the concept was already approved by the board, but when we started drafting the language, I realized that the language, just adding it wasn't as simple as just adding the new approved title in. Some further tweaking was needed, and it was kind of bordering that line between it might be non-substantive, but some people might disagree, so we're erring on the side of caution and bringing it back. So we had asked the board to consider a new degree title for LMFT licensure. The board at its August meeting approved the new title, Clinical Mental Health Counseling with a concentration in marriage, family, and child counseling. And the goal is really to increase portability from other states. One of our schools brought to our attention that they were trying to have a dual license track program for LMFT and LPCC that was called counseling psychology. But the problem with that is that a lot of other states require certain KCREP standards be used in their degree titles. KCREP doesn't recognize explicitly counseling psychology. It would be clinical mental health counseling would probably be the most likely candidate for a degree that would lead to both license paths there. And so if somebody in California graduates with a counseling psychology degree, that satisfies our MFT title definitions and it allows an LPCC license, but then that individual might go to another state and not be eligible for both licenses or might not be eligible for one or the other. So the suggestion was made that we approve the title that the board approved. When I started drafting the language, it was just kind of awkward to drop it in there like that. So if you look on page 39, we did a little bit of a tweak. We said the degree would either be in counseling or clinical mental health counseling with an emphasis in either marriage, family, or child counseling or marriage and family therapy. So there's some wording options. It kind of goes along with an option that we've already been giving. So I just wanted to make sure that that's okay with everybody.
Okay. Any board members? I think the MFT or the MFCC, you still use interchangeably,
Right.
Across the United States. So when you do it either or, and that would avoid going back to change the legislation language because of the change of the title.
Yeah.
So that would help.
Okay.
So any public comments? It's all good. Okay. No public comments. So I think it's board. What is? Yeah, they shake their head. Yep. Okay. So this one, we do need a motion. Okay.
I'll move to recommend to the board to approve this language. Is that?
Yeah. I'll second that. So any other public discussion? Okay. So Christina, I think we're ready for vote.
Okay. Jonathan Maddox,
Yes.
Christina Wong,
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach,
Yes.
Betty Conley.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you very much. So let's move on to discuss the practice setting, definitions, and the subsequent registration numbers. And it looks like it's both Christy and Roseanne. So
Yes.
take it away.
So this is a big. This item has been a big project for a while. We've been working on this in the exempt setting committee, and now here. And what we originally started trying to do was we basically have to clarify our setting definitions. We have increasing concerns about the setting definitions, how they're defined in law, that certain types of settings aren't defined explicitly in law, and so how do we apply the law to all different types of settings? So we had formed the exempt setting committee to discuss this. The exempt setting committee met for about a year. It developed language that we're currently pursuing a bill for now about requiring all psychotherapists to provide information about how to file a complaint. So we're looking to run that right this year. But then the second part of that was to explore different types of settings. So this would help clarify acceptable practice settings for those in various stages of the licensing process, and it would clarify how we apply laws that reference or place limits on different setting types. So the language that you'll see today is only a prototype. We drafted it just for LMFT. It's pretty complex. It does a lot of big things that need some further discussion. So we expect it to change. And then once we feel the board or the committee feels pretty confident that we can move on and draft it for the others, then we'll do that as well. So going a little bit back to recap where we've been. Currently, we only have exempt settings explicitly defined in our licensing law, and that's somebody that's working as an unlicensed or an unregistered person. They can work in a nonprofit, charitable, like a 501(c)(3) entity, schools, various types of schools, whether they're for profit or nonprofit, government agencies, and religious institutions as part of the professional duties. And then, so we have the exempt settings, and then we kind of have everything else. And the question is how to define and apply the law to everything else. There's a variety of different business types out there. LCSW statute comes closest to defining private practice, but even that definition leaves a lot to be desired. And I've included the definition that's in there, as well as the definition of corporation in attachment B of your packet. But then we have all kinds of other settings that don't fall under the definition of a private practice or a professional corporation. We have companies that are owned by not only licensees, which would be like a private practice most commonly, but they are owned by a mix of licensees or private individuals that aren't licensees. You could have partnerships with multiple owners who are non-licensees. Different types of general corporations that do not appear to be professional corporations, and things like that. So when we set out to originally do this work on this project, we tried to define private practice and then other for-profit settings. We tried to start by narrowing that down. And the problem is that it's been raising a number of questions and complications about business structures. We get questions about all different types of business structures in the office. And it almost feels like you need a degree in corporate law to understand what type of business it is. We see businesses that appear to be general stock corporations. We see businesses that are corporations with franchises under them. We see businesses where there's a mix of licensees and other general folks that are owning the company, but then they don't just do therapy, they're doing other stuff. And so the result is that staff, we just don't have the capacity or the knowledge base to answer those types of questions without a lot of technical expertise. The other problem is a lot of times when people call in, they don't exactly know what type of company it is. They're confused. So when we ask questions, we get answers that may or may not be 100% correct, which may lead to them getting wrong information. So we really want to simplify and are hoping to sort of get away from the private practice and corporation definitions. And it also can be difficult to justify, like, why are we putting restrictions on a private practice or a professional corporation, but this company over here that's owned by a mix of different people doesn't have those same limits? What's the reasoning for that? Is that really fair? So that's kind of the things that we've been struggling with. So we tried to propose a different approach here. What we did is we classified, in this case, all settings into just two types: exempt settings and then non-exempt settings. The definition of exempt settings remains the same, and then non-exempt settings are everything that's not in an exempt setting. And then we would reiterate that an individual working in an exempt setting who holds a board-issued license or registration is under the jurisdiction of the board still. We would clarify that an agency that is not licensed or certified by a government agency to provide psychotherapeutic services is not an exempt setting. We've had some people try to or have some confusion, basically, that, well, I'm licensed by a government agency, so that means I'm an exempt setting, right? So there's that. We reiterated that an active license or registration number is required to provide therapy services in any non-exempt exempt setting with 2 exceptions. We carved out an exemption for trainees to provide services in any mental health setting if there's proper oversight, and then also in the 90-day rule applicants to do this as well. We're proposing allowing third-party supervision in any setting if there is written oversight agreements between the supervisor and the employer. Allowing reimbursement expenses on a 1099 in any setting. Previously, it was prohibited in private practice. Prohibiting licensees who conduct business under a fictitious business name from using a false deceptive name. Previously, it was only carved out for a private practice. And then limiting supervisors in any exempt setting to 4 individual or triadic supervisees at a time. And that can be registrants, applicants for final licensure, or people under the 90-day rule, or a combination of those types. Previously, the limit was 3. We thought with the introduction of triadic supervision, having a non-even number didn't make, it makes more sense to bump it up to 4. So we're proposing that here as well. And then when we got to the end, we kind of had to take the proposal a little bit further, because the problem is when you eliminate references to private practice and professional corporation settings, we have that 6-year rule that basically says that you can't work in a private practice with a second registration number. So that sort of comes into play here. So we took a look back at our discussion last year about the 6-year rule, because it's something that we've been kind of discussing and talking about possibly tweaking in the future as well. The Policy and Advocacy Committee last discussed it in February 2018. We looked at the average time to gain experience hours, and the committee kind of decided that we'd wait for we had the buckets bill that streamlined the types of hours of experience that was supposed to help decrease the process, the time it took to get a license. We're allowing triadic supervision now. That's new. We reduced the LCSW experience hours required a little bit, so we kind of had left it at, let's give this all time to phase in. Well, it's kind of just phasing in now, so we don't really have new results yet. At the time, we reported that about 12.6% of MFT associates and about 10.5% of associate social workers were on a subsequent number. And it was taking, it on average, it's been pretty consistent. It's taking about 3.5 years on average to get a license. So that's held pretty steady. So to tackle this, we kind of took a new approach, and we thought we'd just kind of throw this out here. We thought that we would propose extending the length of a registration number and eliminating the private practice prohibition on a subsequent number. In return, because the private practice prohibition is there to sort of encourage people to move along in the licensing process, not remain a perpetual associate. So in return, there still needs to be a incentive to complete licensure. So we proposed that those needing a subsequent registration number would be permitted, if they got that subsequent number, to work in a private practice, but they would take additional graduate level coursework to ensure continued proficiency. Because the longer they get out from their licensing exam, the farther away they get, or the longer they get out from their master's degree, the harder it becomes, in theory, to pass the licensing exam, because they haven't been in school for a while. So we proposed that if an applicant needed a subsequent registration number after 8 years, they would need to have a passing score on the California Law and Ethics exam obtained within the past 2 years, and demonstrate successful completion of 15 semester units of graduate coursework within the past 2 years. That would ensure that their education is current, that they're up to speed on the certain aspects of the profession. And then the private practice prohibition would be removed. So the proposal, that's the proposal that we laid out. It's kind of definitely subject to discussion. It's just, we thought that it might work. Another question that goes along with that is that the age of experience hours is currently allowed to be 6 years. So there need to be some talk about making that more consistent with the 8-year length requirement, but that's another discussion. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. Would like to talk a little bit about AB 93 and what it did, because I know that internally that it does, for us, it does raise some questions about supervision. It's relying a little bit more on supervision for the proposals. AB 93 did take steps to strengthen supervisor requirements. The board now has the authority to audit supervisors, which it didn't previously have. We outlined specific responsibilities of supervisors in more detail, and we specified a minimum amount of supervision for somebody who is done gaining hours of licensure but is still waiting for their final license application to go through. So that was what AB 93 did. We also have our pending supervision regulations, which we're working on getting into the regulation process. That proposal would require all supervisors to complete a self-assessment to the board within 60 days of beginning supervision, so we're going to know who's supervising. It requires the supervisor and supervisee to collaborate to complete a plan outlining the supervision's goals. It would require an supervisor to complete an annual assessment of their supervisee's strengths and weaknesses. It would require a 15-hour initial supervision course and then ongoing every other year 6 hours of supervisor professional development. It would strengthen our written oversight agreements. And it would require supervisors to establish written procedures to contact that supervisor in the event of an emergency. So this raises a lot of questions and a lot of topics. It's a really big item. I have suggested some discussion topics. I won't read them one by one. We can go through them if you want. I know that I've had a little bit of feedback from camp, which I'm sure that Angela will share. I know also Ben Caldwell was not able to be here today. He sent an email detailing some of his thoughts on the proposal, and all of you should have gotten that. It should be on the back table for members of the audience if they're interested. So I guess we can just open up the discussion.
I want to thank Roseanne and Christy. A lot of hard work, and then that's thinking outside the box. And trying to really reorganize and and looking at the issues. So I want to thank you both and all the other parties involved. So wonderful. So there, in the packet, there's already questions. So I don't know if board members want to go through it one by one, or or just free flowing. Whatever. It's, yeah. What's that? I should read it? Yeah, okay. All right, I will. Yeah, go ahead.
I think because this is such a vast amount of information, it'd be helpful to kind of organize it and go through it systematically.
I'm following council's suggestion. I will read the question, and then we can, based on that question, to have some feedback. So the question, the first one is that, is it appropriate for trainees to provide services in any setting, given that they will be under the oversight of their school as well as subject to a written agreement between the school and the site? So what about applicants following the 90-day rules? So it's about trainees. Any thought about Kim?
That third-party supervision, I know that it has initially generated a comment, but I want to point out that that's permissive. It's not required. It's at the discretion of the employer and the supervisor. So if the employer doesn't want that third-party supervisor there, then they don't have to enter into the agreement. So I think so if a school is going to place a trainee in a setting that typically we would have identified as a private practice in the past with supervision, if the school is not comfortable with that, then they don't have to have that third-party agreement. But it's simply there as an option.
So I think that when the trainee were placed in a certain agency, they already have kind of like the learning contract, their learning agreement and goals and stuff like that. So it's really about, trying to ensure between the trainee and the supervisor and the school, whether for the board, that a written agreement is in place, right?
Right, well, the third-party agreement is usually there because there's not a supervisor on site.
Right.
And maybe it's just I don't know, but I have a hard time envisioning putting a trainee in a setting where there isn't a supervisor on site. Maybe that's just naivete, but I would think if
Yeah.
you're trying to train these individuals in ethical practice, you're going to want some, a little higher level of supervision than, say, someone who's just graduated and demonstrated some minimum competency.
Right.
I was going to say, I would just add, I'm the internship program manager for the county where I work, and so one of the requirements for, I would say, almost all of the schools that we work with is that the schools require that that the supervisor of record is on site at all times when the student is providing behavioral health services, or there has been another identified supervisor who's responsible for the work of that student. So that usually is something that the school ensures happens for the safety of the clients and for the professional development of the students, that they aren't just put out there to do any sort of behavioral health services without a supervisor on site. So that's usually managed by the school.
Okay.
And, and in addition to that, sometimes, a lot of the agency will require, to have a contract between the college, and the agency. And so that is another layer. However, I'm also thinking about, nowadays with the popularity of the online school, and that's a little different, because of, that, the possibility of a setting, that they're not able to, to find supervisors. So I think, that risk, not risk, the potential of having an outside supervisor is still there.
Yeah, the potential's there, but again, it's permissive.
The question more goes along the lines of, that there's always been that agreement between the site and the school. The question is more along the lines of, is it appropriate for trainees to work in any practice?
Right. Anywhere.
Anywhere. It could be a private practice. It could be, because it's really, there's a lot of settings out there that don't exactly fit the definition of a private practice. And what the schools struggle with right now is knowing whether their setting is appropriate. So this alternative basically says they can work in any setting as long as they have proper oversight. An alternative, I know that we've had some feedback from the MFT representatives. An alternative might be to sort of do like some kind of a carve out where we say if there are specific settings, types of settings we have concerns about that we don't want trainees working on, but it needs to be very clear and easily identifiable if we do that.
Okay. I'm just thinking about how the carve-out would look like, because, I think it's good. And then I'm, in my mind, I'm just thinking that, if it's any setting, then you can have easily, just a one person, supervisor, and a licensees, and then take an intern, or take a trainee, and then what, and then the oversight will be really, really limited. Yeah.
And speaking to the microphone is hard because you're looking that way and not speaking into the mic.
Sorry.
It's kind of hard to.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Do you want me to say it again?
I actually do, because I wasn't sure what you were saying. I'm sorry.
No, I was thinking about, in terms of, trainee, for the setting. And, it means that if it's any setting, it can be, ranging from, a person, a licensees, having, trainee. And then that would be an internship.
Correct.
So, and then I'm thinking about, what really is about the whole education purpose, for them, and what will be the pros and cons, Let's say that would be kind of like the minimum,
Sure.
right? So, and what will be the pros, and for them what will be the educational benefit for them to be placed in one person agency, and one person, and
So My experience has been hosting trainees in our system of care is that one of the intentions of hosting trainees is to provide them with a holistic experience in their clinical placement, which means they're exposed to sort of multidisciplinary teams of nurses, psychiatric social workers, therapists, social workers who could sort of support their clinical growth and development. And so that's one aspect of it too. I think the other thing too is trainees are required to have weekly didactic training, which exposes them to a range of clinical trainings that once again supports their clinical growth that may or may not be available to them if they're in a private practice setting. So I think with that said, I think it's important for us to potentially consider limiting the placements, the settings where they can train, just because they're inexperienced and they need consistent oversight. 2, they need the didactic training weekly. And that 3, the benefit of the multidisciplinary exposure that will support their clinical growth. And I don't know that all settings can support and provide that for a trainee, once again, who doesn't have the experience. And we're looking to really embed them with as much exposure as possible. So I think it makes sense to sort of look at how we limit their training settings to ensure that those things happen.
So for my, anyway, just to be, I totally follow where you're going with that. So would it be the concern, single practitioner, nobody else is around, Kim's, therapy suite, you come in, it's just me, I'm solely responsible for the lease, solely responsible for all the billing, I'm a sole practitioner, that's it. That may not be a setting that would provide a lot of benefit and growth to a trainee?
Correct. That's
okay.
exactly what I'm saying.
So carving it out somehow that way. And I wonder if that would respond to some of the MFT concerns that we've already received. So
When you say carving it out that way,
carving it out, maybe identifying it, specifically calling out, not in a setting that looks like
private practice.
A, B, C, private practice as we have historically thought of it, single practitioner, I hang out my shingle, that's it.
Correct.
So you have to have a brick and mortar,
Well, I think that,
not a mobile office, huh?
I
I think it's having a much larger comprehensive setting that takes into consideration the fact that trainees are not brought into a system of care as to be an employee. They're actually brought in as a very fragile, inexperienced person who's there to grow and to learn. And as they progress through their academic year, yes, they may warrant more independence, but their actual intention in the setting is to be trained and supported and to be resourced so that they can ultimately become a functioning professional in our system, in our discipline.
Betty and then Christy. You have a comment, right, Betty?
I have a kind of a commenty question, yeah.
Go ahead.
So I'm actually I don't usually have a kind of a strong opinion on this, but I actually have concerns about trainees in private practice. It just doesn't feel like that's what the university programs, any experience that I've had, doesn't seem consistent with what the university goal was. So I guess I'm wondering where the interest or the impetus for even considering, because it wasn't, we have not historically allowed trainees to be in so this would be a change in practice. And I'm just wondering if there was an interest expressed either by trainees or by the universities, or where did this come from? Why are we even thinking of changing practice?
I think that what, it's a proposal to address the difficulties that we have had trying to define private practice, but I think if we get extremely specific on what private practice looks like, because it's a setting we don't want the trainees in, then I think we have defined what we would typically view as private practice, so we could carve that out, that piece out, and then we could move forward with the exempt setting and then everything else.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the general discussion. This was just, I have to be very honest, since this law went into effect, I probably have more gray hair than I really want to know about. It's been a challenge to define what's exempt, what's not exempt, what corporation is, what a private practice is. Because even within the office, we all have different ideas. I mean, there's a school of thought that, well, Kaiser could be a private practice. And I think of a private practice as my little suite, and here I am, and that's me. So it's in sort of the genesis of why we had the exempt committee anyway. But this proposal, or this what we have here, is really more of it came from our difficulties since the first of the year and the new law changes, and trying to respond to associates about, can I work here, can I not work here, and then we were just on a call yesterday with Kaiser.
Yeah.
And I think I've got some really good staff that can get great research, but man, that takes a lot of time, and it shouldn't be that hard.
I think to answer your question, I don't necessarily know that schools have a significant investment in them being in private practice settings. I think what happens sometimes is that students are expelled from placements just due to incompetence or unethical behavior, and they're trying to find another placement so that student can get their hours to graduate. I think another thing that happens pretty frequently is students may not start their academic program in the fall. They may start in the spring or in the summer, and so it puts the student sort of in a dire situation to find a placement, and a lot of placements are less willing to admit students after the fall, because in the fall they have their orientations, they have their onboarding, they have their processes established, and someone who starts in the spring or summer disrupts that, and they may not have the resources to support that. But I think in either case, we're still saying we don't want students who are either incompetent or sort of unethical in private practice settings. And I think systems of care may need to look at how we can onboard students in the spring or in the summer to support their placements. But I think either way, once again, we don't want them in certain settings. So I don't know if that's helpful.
I just don't want to, I'm always looking at, are we putting up a roadblock in some place where we don't want a roadblock? Because we want to have students coming into the profession. I mean, that's obviously, and we want to make that as easy as possible. But at the same time, I just have reservations about the quality of the experience. So I'll just leave it at that.
Right, so I think what we can do is come back to the committee, and after we have some chance to maybe wordsmith what a private practice looks like, to make it extremely specific, so that, because it's clear from your comments as well as some of the early comments that we got, that is of a concern. So I think we'll make that attempt on that.
Christy?
Yeah, so kind of along those lines, I know we want to avoid trying to define settings, so maybe what we do is we define the characteristics that you need for trainees. So a trainee can lawfully practice in any setting that meets these characteristics. The other thing we could look at is the written agreement that's required by law between the school and the setting, and that written agreement is required to contain certain components. There's not very much, and the schools, they expand on it when they do their written agreements, and they incorporate the student into that written agreement. So that's another thing that we could look at, is that section of the law that contains those components.
Okay, so board members, any other comments? So I think for me, I am really, I think, the focus really is about, why we, put the trainee, to train to begin with, and I think ideally, we definitely want trainee to learn well. So when in a practice setting, that has very little mechanism for, accountability and check and balances. I think this is very dangerous. So we want to make sure that, whatever, the language, that, it really is about that learning experience, and for them to learn right. And so now I'm not saying that one person, in private practice is not doable. And yet I think, one person can only do so much, and in an experience of, exposing, the trainees and or the student intern, to, for a proper, work setting. So that's my take. So I want to open up for the public comments, and before that, I think GV has some written comments. Right? Oh, this is from Ben.
Yeah.
It is from Ben. Okay, so I would like to just maybe, I mean, this is a public comment, so should I just read it out loud or not?
You
Or
don't
we
need
just read
to.
it?
Yeah, they've been submitted, and
They s- okay.
we're going to consider them, absolutely.
Okay,
Right, and
absolutely.
It could be, you could, staff is obviously going to consider them
Okay,
and incorporate any, it might be something they missed.
Right,
You've already given staff direction on one portion of this, and then depending what comes out of the rest of the conversation, they'll have more stuff to go back to the drawing board on.
absolutely, absolutely. I'm just thinking that since, he submitted this, maybe the public wants to hear, what he has to say. That's really what I want. Yeah, go ahead,
I've
Roseanne.
provided some copies on the back, if anybody wants one, and I've already gone through the comments, kind of done a little bit of an initial response with some follow-up
Perfect.
thoughts, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much, Roseanne. So public comments. Hi, Kenneth.
Everybody. Kenneth Edwards from CalPIC. I agree with Christie's comments around expanding what should happen in those settings rather than actually outlining exactly how many people should be in the practice. But there are some hesitations to having a one-person practice. Just in my own experience as a practitioner, I mean, I have to see my clients. I can't supervise somebody. So we should consider that as well. But I mean, when do we make the number? I mean, is it 2 people, 3 people, 5 people? So it's about having the mechanisms in place.
Okay. Thanks, Kenneth. Any other public comments?
Good morning, Angela Blanchard on behalf of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. I just want to thank the board members for the thoughtful comments this morning. This is exactly what CAMP has been thinking about in terms of our concerns about how to define private practice and what is best for the consumer and also what is best for the trainee. So we look forward to working with Roseanne and the rest of the board as we go forward. This is a very complex issue and we've only had a couple of days to analyze it. So looking forward to a little bit more time. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Jan Lee?
Jan Lee Wong, NASW. I'm here.
Welcome for you.
I think it's really important just to start off with having some idea that whatever actions you take, regulatory, policy interpretation, could have unintended consequences. So in this whole discussion, one of the unintended consequences is that the board is starting to influence, perhaps even dictate, education policy. You are telling schools that this is how they should set up their field programs, their practicum programs. These are the requirements for the practicum programs. That's not your role. You're bordering on role confusion. You are not the educational accrediting body. You're not. What you're trying to do is say, we will take hours from these students in these kind of settings. You're not trying to say these settings are the ones the school should have, and here are the characteristics of these settings. That's not your role. And it's very important that you not get into that because of unintended consequences. Pretty soon you will be determining what makes up the marriage family therapy degree. You will be saying, here are the curriculum requirements for the marriage family therapy degree. You have to have some confidence, and I understand the lack of confidence in the school's mission and ability to produce master's degrees for marriage family therapy that are quality degrees that produce good professionals. You have to have some confidence in them. Now, your confidence would be strengthened if you have a system like social work has. And many of you know social work programs are accredited by a national body, the Council on Social Work Education. It's the same accreditation body for the entire country for all social work schools. Marriage family therapy does not have that here in this state. There is some national accreditation, but the schools don't have to follow it, and you don't require it. If you look at your statute, you do require it for social work degrees. You do. So all I'm trying to say is, like, try to stay on mission here. Don't wander into trying to set educational policy. And if you want to strengthen the degree, one of the ways to do that is to follow social work's example and start thinking about how can we require national accreditation for MFT degrees.
Jan, I have a comment. So while I appreciate that, isn't one of our roles to ensure consumer protection? And so we want practitioners who are providing that care to be in an environment where they're going to optimally grow, especially students. So I think what we're trying to do is ensure that any practitioner who is seeing clients or consumers in this state are being seen by a practitioner who is resourced and supported and put it in an optimal environment where they can grow, especially as we're looking at students who are very inexperienced, don't have the academic exposure that a licensed or even an associate would have. So I think we're looking at how do we protect consumers by ensuring that trainees are in settings where they're going to get the optimal opportunity to grow and be exposed to clinicians and clinical opportunities and clinical information that's going to help them grow and be better providers. So I think, in my opinion, we're actually looking at consumer protection and not dictating any sort of academic requirements for graduation.
Yeah, and that's well put. There is a fine line between trying to figure out exactly how you're going to protect consumers. So there's a lot of interest by this board over the years in the idea of prevention. If you do these things in advance, helping people get licensed, we will prevent not very good practitioners, unethical practitioners, illegal practitioners, because we did these things in advance. But prevention is a very difficult thing to prove. It's very difficult to initiate, execute, and to evidence. Your strongest role is, unfortunately, post facto. When a licensee or registrant violates your laws, your rules, your regulations, professional conduct, that's where you have the strongest ability to protect the public. It's after the fact. We don't like to hear that because that means somebody was harmed. But frankly, if you look at your history and what you do and what the other regulatory boards do, that's your strongest function. You know, you want to be prevention oriented, you want to do that, but it's very hard to do, and you can't do it that well.
So I want to bring up a point also, so the trainee, what also when we look at the question, it's not just about the trainee, it's about that continuum, because they might be the trainee to begin with, and then you go into the 90-day rules, and then you go into being an intern. And so, so I know it's really gray, in a sense that, there's so many cooks in the kitchen about the whole trainee experience. But I think, when you really look at also the bigger picture, that, that there is a chance that, if we say that, yeah, they can stay in private practice, and yes, they can, the trainee can stay in private practice, and then for the 90-day rules, and they can count their experience, then I think the board, will have the, the responsibility to really look at, if this is something that, also, under our jurisdiction. So, this is a complicated question, and we have a very wonderful input. So where should we go from there? Yeah.
We still have a few more little tidbits.
Oh, I
to
know
chat
for this
about.
one. Yeah, right.
So on the practice settings, I think we've had two good suggestions. So we'll come back with some language that hopefully addresses some of the concerns on that.
Betty?
Before we move on,
Right. No,
just to respond to Jan Lee, because I share the concern about exceeding our mandate. But just to clarify, we already dictate the setting in which a trainee can practice, because we dictate whether we're going to accept those hours or not.
Right.
So I just wanted to kind of clarify that we're not exceeding what we're already doing. We're only clarifying for our trainees where, in fact, they can get their hours that we will accept.
And reinforcing best practices for a student. This is a best practice for developing therapist, student, trainee.
right.
And I think our schools, when we did the exempt setting committee, we got feedback that they want more clarity, because right now there's a lot of confusion on what exactly, there's a lot of things that you can argue is or is not a private practice. It's not clear cut.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, so I'm looking at the time. So it's 10:10 now. Should everybody, do anybody want a little break or we continue on? We're good. Okay. 10:30? Okay. Suggestion? Okay, so maybe we'll take a quick break or you want to discuss until 10:30?
Go until 10, my suggestion would be to go until 10:30. That's a reasonable.
Okay.
Okay, no, that's fine.
What?
I'm just making sure that people can stay in their seats.
I'm okay for another 20 minutes. Appreciate the consideration.
Absolutely. I want your comfort, so. Great. So let's move on to the second question. Are there any potential adverse effects of allowing third-party supervision in all settings? So it means that, if you're, I'm going to use the extreme case that you have a private practice, a one person, all setting, right? A licensed clinician and have a private practice and then hire a third party to do supervision. That's basically what it is, right? That's the extreme case.
Yeah.
Yep, from the very, to a a big mega health store, to hire multiple clinical supervisor to supervise. I think that's what we're talking about, right? Okay. Any adverse effects?
Concerns.
I mean, I think going along the same line of conversation we were just having a second ago, if there are trainees in that setting and there isn't an established clinical supervisor on site, then once again, we are compromising sort of the development of the trainee one and then compromising the sort of quality of care that the consumer is receiving if there is an emergency. For example, there are many times where the client may say, I feel like hurting myself, and a trainee panics and doesn't know what to do. Well, if there's no supervisor on site to help walk them through that process, to sort of help mitigate their anxiety and then give them a course of action, then that's a problem for the consumer. And so I think that we need to look at, once again, sort of what settings and sort of what environments can have a third, not have a supervisor on site and function sort of healthily.
How would you feel the same for an associate?
I mean, in my experience, having been a registered intern associate, I think you're equally anxious when certain things happen on site, and there should be a clinical supervisor on site to help mitigate sort of the inexperience of an associate. I mean, you could be an associate and be 2 months out of graduate school. I mean, you're still equally inexperienced, and so there really should be someone on site to help you manage certain situations clinically.
I just wanted to toss in that, correct me if I'm wrong, but current law says associates working in a private practice, their supervisor has to be employed full-time and practicing at the site. Doesn't necessarily say they have to be on site at the same time. So just something to keep in mind. Doesn't mean we can't tweak that, but just that's how it is right now.
So that's, and Christy, thank you very much for actually bringing it up, because I was trying to think about, what the change is. So it's really about the private practice that, for current law, the private practice that, the supervisor has to be on site.
Right.
He's employed by the same person, same agency.
Yeah, currently that's for a private practice or a corporation.
Right. So I have a little question about all setting, because this is actually confusing to me, because, I think we have the previous discussion say like, child welfare, and so sometimes, child welfare may bring in, as a third party. So I don't know if that would create, some sort of like confusion, that thinking that all setting means that any setting.
But typically, child welfare settings are not doing therapy. They're providing social work services, and many times that person is a consultant to help consult on cases.
That's a different discussion. I'm just bringing, just thinking about when we say all setting, whether there is an unintended consequence that it might, create some, expanding more than just what we thought about, private practice, but, inviting the other, probably non-quite mental health setting and say, oh, if I have, employ a outside supervisor, then, then I can do, those people can count their hours.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we just we could table this one and think about it and then have a more in-depth discussion if we come back with carve-outs for private practice.
Yeah, staff may be able to, I mean, as you guys work your way through the rest of the questions, it may also change what this might happen, and they can obviously come up with different alternatives for your consideration.
Right, right, right. Public comments, Jen Lee?
Jan Lee Wong, NASW. Another area that is potentially a bog. That's a British word for like a swamp. So
I'll check with John.
let's just take the very narrow example of one-person private practice, and then you bring in a third-party supervisor, even though the person running the private practice is possibly qualified to be the supervisor. So why they would bring in a third party is a big question mark. Let's say that happens. Then you're going to have potentially a legal liability question. In other words, if the consumer feels they've been harmed by the trainee, do they sue the owner of the private practice, the solo practitioner? Do they sue the third party outside supervisor? I'm just raising these questions. I don't have the answers, but since you mentioned you're going to table it and go back to the discussion, I thought I'd throw that item in, that question, as a discussion question for you.
Thank you. Very legitimate question,
Thank you for
actually.
making it boggier.
Yeah, yeah. No, but that's also a very important, part of consideration. So thank you, Jan Lee. Kenneth?
Hi, Kenneth Edwards, California Association for LPCC. Another consideration would be if that hired third-party supervisor doesn't have experience working with who they've been hired to work with. So someone who might be a private practitioner is hiring themselves out to go to a community health agency or a hospital or something else that just doesn't match up with what their experience is. So I wonder, could that be another question or discussion point?
Thank you. So it seems to me that, that the question always come from is that, when you have, again, a formal organization has their check and balances. And yet, in private practice, there's none. So when anything happen, in case of, any potential, risk, then, then private, what is the responsibility of the third party supervisor, which is another, a very important thing to consider. Yeah. Angela.
Good morning again. Angela Blanchard on behalf of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. Just very briefly, the comments that Board Member Maddox outlined are exactly the comments and concerns of CAMFT. So just want to thank you and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Glad we have great mind thinks alike, huh? Okay. So it looks like it might be another question that we will need to, go back and kind of digest it a little bit more before we can bring some solution or suggestion, more concrete solution or language, for the board to discuss. So we'll just table that one. Okay. So 10:19, break or not break? Let's keep going. 10:30, okay. Because, if I open it up, it might be past 10:30. Okay. 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 But just being caring. Are there any thoughts about limiting supervisors in a non-exempt setting to 4 individual triadic supervisees
So the ratio would go from 1 to 3 to 1 to 4.
for the non-exempt setting? And this is okay. So Christy, I like how you bring it back. So what is the previous version for this one? So is it the regulation for only allowing 1 to 3 supervisees?
So currently, that's private practice or professional corporation, that's the rate, the 1 to 3. Exempt
Right.
settings can have as many, there's no limit.
I thought isn't AB 93 also changed that language to like 15 or something like that?
They removed that the 15.
Yeah, it removed the
You
15.
can remove it, the 15, the cap at 15 was removed. So
Right.
as long as it's 1 to 3, you can have 20 supervisors, and then 1 to 3 would be 60? Trainees, supervisees, that's fine.
So, okay, just for my clarification, I thought the triadic means that one supervisor to two.
Right.
Right.
Right, okay. So,
So each supervisor right now, you can do triadic supervision, and then total, you as a supervisor can only be actively supervising
4 people,
3 people right now.
3 people right now.
You can't do all 3 together, but you can do 2 of them together. So if it was 4, you could, in theory, do 2 and 2.
2 and 2,
Right now,
right.
you'd have to do 2 and 1.
Right. Actually sound reasonable. Betty?
I was just reading Ben's comments, and it doesn't seem like we're changing the group supervision. His comment was, provide individual, do not count towards the total, something about supervisors with groups, and that they could unlimited number of supervisees by only offering group supervision. I didn't see where we were even talking about that or touching it. So is that not something we're even changing?
So the language on where we tried to clarify this is on page 52 of your packet. At the top of the page, subsection C. So what we're trying to do here is we bumped up the limit of 3 to 4. And then we tried to clarify that, because we get the question in the licensing unit, well, you say that each supervisor is only allowed to have up to 3 people, but you can supervise up to 8 in a group. So how does that make sense? So we were trying to clarify that.
Right.
Because so I'm doing group supervision. Does that mean those are my 8 and I get no more? Does that mean that I'm supervising more than I can because I have 8 in a group, but 8 in a group's allowed? Like, what does that mean? So we're trying to provide some clarity there, because the law doesn't really, it kind of goes against itself.
Count toward this total. I guess I just didn't interpret that as changing what we were already doing substantially.
Yeah.
Am I
No,
just
it's-
reading that wrong?
It's
or-
just
No,
stating it specifically.
Okay.
Hi, Darlene.
Darlene York, the BBS, Board of Behavioral Sciences. Okay, so I think there's a little bit of confusion going on. The way we interpret the way the law's written is, in a private practice setting or a corporation, the supervisor is only allowed to have 3 associates underneath them. But in the non-exempt, there is no limit. However, they can have up to 2 people in their individual hour of supervision, which is now, triadic. So there's still no limit on how many they could supervise. So when they go to their group, most of the time there's other supervisors, but there's still no limit, because now they're doing 2 hours a group. So they're up to have, up to 8 in that group. It's the limit on the 3 in a private practice or corporation. There is no limit on the exempt setting, but that 1 hour is still triadic for the exempt. So it's treated equally as an hour. So I don't know, because it seems like you guys are talking about private practice and exempts combined. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, and I think on the number 8, it's just, hey, it's a group, we're having group supervision, and as we've heard, there might be 1 or 2 supervisors in the group facilitating, but you've signed a responsibility statement for your limit. That's who you're responsible for. That's just because you're taking 5 others in there. I don't know that that counts towards your responsibility.
But it's actually not uncommon for a clinical supervisor to provide clinical supervision individually and have a responsibility to provide group supervision
Right.
to a larger group. So
Well, I didn't
I don't understand.
what the issue was, but I thought maybe I missed something.
Well, I don't,
So it's really about, the setting, and in responding to the private practice rule that, it's only, it's 1 to 3 supervisee, 1 supervisor to 1 supervisee, and then now we're just changing it to 4. And the mix of the, it's about, the kind of like the group supervision concept, but the group supervision really is not, it's kind of in the mix, but it's also not in the mix, because group supervision actually, it's a form of supervision, and yet when we're talking about, the private practice or the non-exempt, we're changing, responding to that part of the law that we raise it from the 3 to 4. So, and yeah, so anyway, I don't know.
So is
It is confusing.
is non-exempt, like, what all does that encompass? Is that private practice, like a community mental health setting, a hospital setting? It's like that broad range of,
Everything else,
Everything
everything that's
else.
not exempt.
okay.
Right. Jan Lee?
Jan Wong, NASW. It's also really important to understand that individual or didactic supervision or
Triadic.
triadic supervision is really different kind of supervision than group supervision, very different. So to mix the two up, as some people have and said they're both the same, is not true. The other thing is, historically, people have done group supervision. Goes all the way back to the beginning of the profession. So, for example, in social work, one modality, it's still practiced today, but not as popular as it was 50 years ago, is group work. It's called group work. Social workers do group work. They work with groups. So doing group supervision includes elements, methods, skills that are helpful in group work. So it's a different situation. We have a modern version of that today. I think it was mentioned, Jonathan mentioned it. When you do a case conference, that is a version of group supervision. You have a team of professionals, they're all sitting around a table. They talk about one case. It might belong to one of the members of the team. And that's a version of group supervision. So we have to make sure we don't mix the two up and say they're both the same, so that number doesn't equal, it's illogical, and we go down the rabbit hole when we do that.
So I like to maybe give an example. So let's say in a private practice, so, currently private practice or a non-exempt setting. So, so if you have, the new proposal would be if you have 4 intern, licensees, associate, whatever, then you will have 1 supervisor. Now, if you have another set of 4, another, 4 same group of people, and then you will have another supervisor. And yet, they are employed by the same agency, you can pull it together and have either one of the person to do the group supervision. Correct, right? And so generally, I think, we're talking about, pretty much the same thing. And I love group supervision, that's what I do, and that's what I love too. And it brings in a very, important dynamic. But I think, also when we're talking about, the racial, in a non-exempt setting, that's what we're trying to increase the to make sure that the consumer protection or even, ensuring the quality of the mental health services by not just having 1 supervisor to oversee that 8 people.
Right.
So we still have to have that 2 and 2. So, yeah, just want to echo what you said.
Yeah, I think what we're saying is that we want you as the supervisor that signs the responsibility statement, you can't have any more than you're responsible for.
Exactly.
When you send it
which
to
one
group,
is this?
that's beneficial.
That's a different thing,
Yeah.
yes.
So maybe we don't want to have the language in there to clarify, maybe we just don't want to say group supervisees does not count toward the total. Maybe we just leave it silent like it is now. Okay.
It's probably a little bit clearer too.
Okay.
Hi.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hi, how are you guys doing today? My name is Brittany Little. I am from DaVita Dialysis. I'm sorry, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
My name is Brittany Little. I am from DaVita Dialysis. I am here on behalf of our LCSW supervisors within the Northern and Central California. I am their division lead social worker, and I will be helping them continue to vigorously prep to adhere to the new BBS laws that came out effective January 1st. Our LCSWs have a number of questions, and I know that we're on a very limited time. I just wanted to clarify a couple things so we can make sure we're in line. So for DaVita Dialysis, given the fact that we have outpatient medical clinics across California, will we be considered a incorporated, or is it where do we lie in those laws?
Actually, I'm going to have to, unless your comments are going to be exactly addressing the discussion here, I would have to direct you maybe to contact staff outside of the meeting to get some more specific advice.
No, absolutely. For supervision, I just wanted to clarify. So it's now 4. So when is that effective?
So also, so like none, this is just an idea right
Okay.
now. So this is like, they're tossing around ideas. Are they going to then pursue legislation to make the change?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what they're discussing right now. So we don't have, there is no changes happening or in the works even yet. This is purely, it's like the infantile type of stage it is.
No, absolutely. So if I want clarifications about the new BBS law, should I wait until afterwards, or is it just based off settings? Can I ask questions about settings?
I can give you mine.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can give you my card, and you can call me directly, and we can have a powwow.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. I
You're
appreciate it.
welcome. Thank you very much. Any other comments? So it looks like, okay, so I think we kind of discussed a lot of things, in relating to group supervision, the racial and stuff like that. But I'm not hearing a lot of opposing, voices about, increasing to 4.
So the 4, we can't go forward with that.
I think we can go forward
in the
with that.
proposal, and then
Yeah.
take out the what we're trying to clarify about the 8. We'll just leave that the way it is in current law.
Okay. And then your suggestion is to, leave that group supervision, take it out and
Yeah,
make it silent.
we would just leave it.
Right. And Christy?
I did want to just point out, it's brought something to mind. In current law, it's the 1 to 3 for private practice and corporations, professional corporations. This would newly subject a ratio to other certain types of for-profit settings that don't currently have a limit. So that might be something to keep in mind as we progress through here. It might have some unintended consequences, so that's just.
I'm really thinking that, since we restructure that, the proposal to restructure exempt and non-exempt setting, and we put a lot of the criteria under, what is the exempt and the responsibility and stuff, for the supervisor and who's under whose jurisdiction. And yet I think, once we really kind of fine combing it, I think we will find a lot of these holes. It's like, what really it means that to all other settings. Right. So, so
I think one of the unintended consequences may be there are a lot of community-based organizations and governmental settings like county settings where there are fewer licensed staff, and so they are taking on the responsibility of supervising larger numbers of associates. And so putting something like this into place may impact the capacity of our associates to get their hours to be licensed, depending on maybe if they're in more rural settings or smaller agencies where there are just less licensed staff. We may be impacting their ability to get their hours unless they bring in an outside supervisor, like we talked about in a previous question, to ensure that they're overseeing the hours of these associates.
Right. So it wouldn't apply to like a government. Government agencies would be fine. The organizations, that's a little bit more of a question. That's where we get into kind of, there's no rules right now for those, so the law is kind of a question mark. If it's a nonprofit and charitable, they're considered in an exempt setting. If it's something else, then we have to figure out, is it a private practice? What is it? And there's a lot of something else type things. So that's where we're trying to sort of.
Yeah.
But maybe because I'm having a hard time because non-exempt setting is such an abstract term. Maybe at some point we could have a listing of sort of who would fall under what, so that we could make a more informed decision about should we increase, should we make decisions based on that? Because I'm getting lost in exempt, non-exempt, just the framing of the wording and who that includes.
Well, if you look at I think it's always helpful for me to go back to the definition of exempt setting. So it's everything that doesn't fall in that definition would be subject to what we were just talking about, the ratios.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that, go ahead.
The exempt being the schools.
School, college, university, nonprofit and charitable, or any government agency.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anything that's not that would fall under the non-exempt, and it would be subject to the supervision limits, things like that.
Okay.
And the reason that we're proposing that is because right now there's so many settings where they don't look like a private practice, but they maybe look more like a private practice than something else. And that's just, then you get into all of these legal discussions about how is the organization structured, and we really can't answer those questions
No.
properly.
And I've been on the Secretary of State's website at least 3 or 4 times this week trying to figure it out, how they're set up and what their structure is. And, you know, it shouldn't be that hard.
Okay, well, so, but it looks like still, when we're okay with this, and there's still certainly, again, for the staff, I think these are good in discussion, whether, it will expand to the current private practice instead of those business corporation. And so I think, that would be another area that, that when you look at the language, that you can give some thoughts and make some recommendation for the board to consider. Betty?
It seems like it's a positive trade-off. There's probably going to be some unintended consequences for some of these entities that were kind of in Neverland. But they're going to trade off the fact that now they are coming under some guidance with the fact that there's clarity in terms of whether they can count hours, what hours they can count. I mean, it just seems like the trade-off is on the positive end on that one. So it seems.
Okay. All right. So wonderful discussion, and I want to thank everybody. So let's take a break. It is 10:36, and let's come back at 10:45. Thank you so much. All right, welcome back to the Board of Behavioral Sciences Policy and Advocacy Committee meeting. The time is 10:49 a.m. So we have been discussing about the exam setting and the private practice definitions and such. So we will continue on that conversation. Now, I have kind of like a quick suggestion and then see what, the board members think about it. Because the concept is so new, the language is so new. And so, and we did have a, exam setting committee, to look at, those languages. And so, so Roseanne and I would just, have a little, sidebar conversation that maybe, it would be a good idea, to have, whether the board will think that, or the committee will think that going back to the exam setting committee, have a smaller discussion, carve out, or, to look at the languages and then bring it back to the policy and advocacy committee. And then we can probably, have a different level of fine combing, the language instead of, using this, to have a lengthy discussion. Like that idea?
So we'd have to reinstitute or
Probably just
reactivate
reactivate the exam setting committee, and which will be you and
might
me.
be more a better use of time.
Yeah, I think so too. And so it's the pleasure of the board chair, and we can defer it back to your decision. But I think that's one of the recommendations that I think it would be, it's a better use of our time. So, and then also we can have a more, cozy discussion about, the details.
Right. When I was going to say, when we're carving out the definition of everything, we can definitely, as staff,
Oh, no, you guys-
bring back a definition, but it might be nice to have like more of the one-on-one input or have a discussion when we're formulating the discussion. It might be nice to formulate the definition like of a setting that can't have third-party supervision, or the setting where a trainee can or cannot work. It might be nice to have some of the schools there for feedback. We could take a shot at it, but it's probably not going to be a home run for the first time.
No. So I think that would be, probably invite, just expand, the stakeholders' input, and I think that probably, it's easier.
So reconstitute the exempt committee perhaps, and then maybe have 1 or 2 meetings to vet out the language. Okay.
Okay. So, public comments. Like that idea? More meetings to come. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Very good. So in that sense, now I think committee members, we can continue to discuss this, language, maybe take the input and then back to, if our board chair is, like the idea, then we can actually, bring it back. And talk more about that. Okay, so let's follow the number 4th question. Should registration length be expanded to 8 years? And should subsequent registrants be allowed to work in any setting? So, is the 8 years with the, with the addition of that 15 units, semester units of the graduate level courses, based on the idea that, that CEUs are not required by the by the associates.
I have that one.
Yeah. So
Okay with 8?
I mean, what's the present concern that we're considering expanding it to 8 years versus leaving it at 6?
Well, it's a lot.
And then I guess the question is, are we looking at doing 2 8 years? So then it becomes 16 years. I mean, so what are the implications and the concern?
The reason that we kind of went down this road with this is because if we were gonna not have maybe if we have to define settings, and if we can't get a clear-cut definition of all the types of settings, if we're going to sort of broaden it, then we sort of have to eliminate the you can't work in this setting after this number of years. So we thought it would be fair. We've had this discussion. It's been kind of an ongoing. It comes up about once a year, the 6-year rule. There's people with life circumstances that aren't able to get their hours in 6 years, and so they start to struggle with not being able to work in a private practice. So we thought, well, if we move it out to 8, that gives a fair allowance for some life circumstances to happen and the person to still continue on and be able to get the the hours that they need. If they don't, we'll let them continue to work in any setting because we aren't in theory defining private practice anymore, or it's going to be a very narrow definition. But we still want to have that incentive to come and go along with licensure. Like, you can't just become a perpetual intern. There has to be some sort of encouragement along the way to become licensed.
Right now, we have some interns that are on their 3rd registration. They have absolutely no desire to become licensed.
I know them.
Yes, and we don't. The concern is, if you're on your 3rd registration, so now you've done at least 12 plus years, you've had no remedial education that we require of licensees. There is no mechanism in the law to nudge them along the way to licensure. So we thought 8 years, give people an allowance for, and we just settled on that number. It can be any number. It could be 10, it could be,
We're not particularly attached. We just want it to be reasonable.
But I think along with that, if you wanted the subsequent number, then you need to complete some education to ensure some competency.
So if I'm understanding right, the concern is that there are some people who cannot get all of their hours within that first 6-hour window.
There is a percentage, yes.
And so the thought is to expand it to 8 and then add the educational requirements to mitigate them being so far removed from their academic program?
Yes.
And then does that mean that how many registrations are we allowing them to have before we say, okay, this is moving beyond the scope of what we intended for someone to actually get their license and not become a perpetual associate?
Could be thrown into the discussion. Right now, we currently don't have a limit, and this proposal right now doesn't have a limit.
But I don't know if we can legally ever lock, and that's a question for legal. We can't say, okay, you can never come back and get a registration number again. I don't know that we can do that. Usually, when looking at other boards, there's a way. Either you have to meet current education requirements, which means in some cases, like because we've changed, like with LPCC, it went from 48 to 60, you would have people that would need to go back and get a whole new degree because it's changed. That's kind of harsh, but I mean, you would either have to meet some boards say you have to meet current education requirements, so new degree if education requirements have changed, or there's additional, like, you have to take additional coursework to get back into the exam, like Pharmacy Board does. This is kind of modeled after their exam requirements, which are after you fail the exam a certain number of times, you have to take 15 units in the areas that you fail. We don't really have that threshold. We have a registration. So it's kind of modeled after that. Because there's different things we can do, but this kind of seemed the most equitable.
Do we have any prohibition on at what point someone would not be allowed to be in a private practice setting and be an ongoing associate? So like, what is that?
Yes, right now it's after 6 years.
So after your first registration, if you have not gotten licensed, you no longer can work in a private practice setting.
Right.
And would we consider for this 8 years, that would be after the 8 years, if you haven't gotten your license, you can no longer work in a private practice setting. Is that, would that be a consideration also that we're looking at?
It could be. We're
could
not
be.
proposing it right now. We're saying 8 years, and then if you complete the 15 units at a graduate level, you can go back and work in whatever practice you want.
The thought is we get about every year, we get some people coming in that are concerned that they had a hardship, and after 6 years, they couldn't get their hours. So now they can't work in a private practice, which makes it even more hard to get their hours. So we thought that if we proposed the coursework, this might show, well, this person is really dedicated to, continuing in the profession. We'll let them work in a private practice, but in sort of return, they have to show this dedication by completing this coursework.
Thank you for the clarity.
And to answer your question, there are some states that do limit how many registrations you can have. It's one and done in some states.
Okay.
So,
I think Betty has her hand up.
yeah, Betty has a question. Yep.
Well, I have a couple of comments. I actually strongly support moving to 8 years, because the people that I see that are getting caught that can't get their work done in 6 tend to be the exact population that we're trying to promote more practitioners. They're people that are trying to work 3 jobs and still get their hours. I mean, so I strongly support that. I know people out there that are trying to get those hours, and it just is really hard. On the other hand, I have concerns about the way it's written right now with graduate level coursework, because I absolutely support that we need to keep, and maybe the answer is to limit the number of registrations. Maybe that's the way we go. But my concern is that re-enrolling in a graduate program. That implies that they have to actually go back to a university graduate level program and re-enroll. And I'm not even sure that the institutions are, we don't have anyone from a university here, but it just seems like that would be really challenging to get readmitted into a graduate program when you've already graduated with a master's and take courses, because you can't just enroll in a university and say, I want to take this course and this course and this course. It's a really complicated process. So if we're talking about continuing ed units, that's I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with the law and ethics exam. I just have a logistical concern about people satisfying the requirement of re-enrolling in a graduate program after they've already graduated. And somebody else may have it and say, no, that's not a problem. They can do that. It's easy to do.
We may want to investigate, because my experience is I went to graduate school in Oklahoma. And so when I came here and applied for my registration, before I could get a number, I needed to take a California law and ethics class. And I was able to go to Cal State Hayward and just take that class without enrolling in their MFT program. But my experience is that you don't have to enroll in the program, but we may want to get broader feedback from someone just to ensure that that's the case across the board. And I think my other thought is I'm concerned about us allowing them to practice in any setting after that first initial registration, because I think one of our inherent motivations for getting licensed is that provides you the opportunity to be in private practice. And so if we're allowing people who are perpetual associates to work in those settings, there's an actual disincentive to actually get licensed if you want to work in private practice. You can continue to be an associate for eternity. as long as you're getting the appropriate quote-unquote supervision, whatever that may look like, since none of us are there. So I think I would be reluctant to, after that first registration, allowing people to be in that sort of setting and not be licensed, because once again, in my opinion, it's a disincentive to get licensed.
Christine?
So I haven't said much during this conversation because it's complicated, and I think you have to really understand how the education goes for these professions. But two things. I just want to read a comment that Ben had about this particular topic and then offer my own thoughts on it. So Ben says, can I just read it? Is that okay? Okay. A greater concern is the requirement for the 15 units of graduate level coursework. Let's see, a great many CSU schools generally do not accept non-matriculating students. And Ben is, by the way, in education, so I think he would know. Associates needing a second registration number would need to find a private university willing to offer this coursework to them. And even if they were able to find such a university, completion of these units requires significant investment in both time and money. At many private universities, graduate courses cost $1,000 or more per unit, and this cost is rising. The education and testing necessary for a second registration number under this proposal is likely to be greater than $20,000 for many. So that's what Ben offers. And if that's true, and I have to assume it is because Ben's in education, that's very concerning. And when I was listening to the conversation earlier, two things I heard. One, the further out you get from school, the harder time you have passing the boards or whatever it's called. But I don't think that's our concern, how hard it is for them to pass the boards. The thing that did resonate with me is we require licensees to do continuing education to stay up. And I think that is, I don't know the word, okay, I mean, good, it should be happening. And so, but we don't require licensees to do graduate level coursework. So I'm just wondering if maybe some sort of continuing education is more appropriate here based on all this. Absolutely. That's my thoughts.
Perhaps, and I think our initial thought on defining what kind of coursework they got was to make sure it's not a quick online course where you click, 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 and get the paper. So that was my initial concern, having seen some of that when we were doing CEs providers. That's and it still occurs now, but at least we have some more agencies with a little more rigorous oversight. But
can I respond to
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
Totally get it, totally agree. I see that in my profession as well. But we did kind of get out of that business of
Right.
continuing ed. And so I think we kind of have to let that go because we did make a decision to let it go.
Right.
The oversight of that particular piece.
And actually, Christine totally spoke my mind. I think, if the whole idea is to keep them current, and keep them, updated and, and to continue to, to focus, on the professional knowledge. I think it's probably good to be consistent with the licensees, the 36 hours, for 2 years. And then you don't have to limit them, to take law and ethics and stuff. And I agree with what Christine said too. Yes, it can be online, but I think, nowadays, I'm taking, continuing education now. They are not as easy, anymore.
Okay.
So, so I think I can live with, say like be consistent with the 36 units, which is like you split it up, it's 18 hours per year, and which is kind of similar to that 15, the 15 units will equate about what, 45 units of the continuing education. So I think that might be a good compromise. So it's not too costly, and yet we also encourage them to to take the classes that that they can prepare for the examination, so that they can get out of that cycle. The cycle of being an intern forever.
Right, and even if we do this, they still could be an intern forever.
They still can, but at the same time, if you have the requirement for them to complete 36 units, and then you get the subsequent number, but yes, they can. And then the next roundabout, they will have to take another, 36 units. And
So Christine, are you suggesting that they do 36 for the 8-year window, or 36 every 2 years? Because if you're saying 36 every 2 years, that becomes 144 CEs over the 8-year
No,
period.
no. I think it's, it's the, it's in replacement of the 15 units semester, the 15 semester units. So it will be, it will need to be taken after, for the first renewal, not renewal, for the first subsequent number, they will need to pass the law and ethics, and also with, to show proof that they have done that 36 units within the last 2 years. That's what the language is proposed. And I think, Jonathan, that's actually brought a good point. Whether maybe the subsequent number that they need to continue to take 36 units for 2 years. I mean, that would be a possibility.
Well,
to
then,
impose that.
if we do that, then essentially you're creating a lower level, you're creating almost a second licensure class by doing that. Just kind of a lower level. Because you have the licensees having to do that, and then every 8 years, as long as that registrant satisfies that every 8 years, then, they can continue. I think our intent, or at least, the discussions that we've had in the office, is to encourage people to complete the licensure process, because that was what the language of the law is intending. So, our thought when we said the 15 semester units was, yeah, it's going to be pricey, but that would maybe incentivize someone to, hurry up and get their license and complete the licensure process. So that was, but if that's what they wanted to do, then okay, fine, they can continue to do that, but it's at their expense rather than consumers. Yeah, I think I have strong concerns about those folks that are sitting out there that on that third registration number, they tend to work in arenas where probably the most vulnerable population goes to, and these people are not attempting to even the clinical exam. And not that they're not capable, but I do have some concerns about, the delivery of services when I think about all the changes in the delivery in mental health that has occurred. So I guess I just don't have an appetite for that.
So I don't think it's, I mean, along the line, if we change to 8 years and we allow, subsequent number, maybe we can also consider limiting the number of the subsequent number.
Yeah.
Because truly, if we expand it to 8 years and then they renew, they get a subsequent number, then the second time when it's time is done, it's 16 years.
Yeah, that's a long time.
That's a very long time
And
in anybody's career.
At that point, the only way to get back in basically would be to get a new degree, probably.
Right.
Yeah.
But after 16 years,
Right.
many things change.
Yes, they do. And we have people now that are in that third registration, and by the time they finish that, that's 18 years, and there's nothing in the law that says they can't have a fourth.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can, it just, I think what bothers me is in some ways, it mirrors what happens in the drug and alcohol counselor community when there's certification. You can essentially work in that arena under one certifying body for 5 years and not complete the process, and then go to the next body and do it again and do it again, and then 30 years later, you've got a career.
Right.
But you've never met anybody's certification.
Right. Christine and then John.
Yeah, so while I do support expanding to 8 years, I think it's imperative that we do limit this, because I don't believe the intent of the law was ever to allow this to happen. We want
agree.
full licensees.
So yeah, so it sounds like the intent is, one, to ensure that people, once they are licensed, are marginally up to date with academic standards, so that they can go out and practice ethically and be clinically appropriate, for lack of a better term. And then two, to ensure that we are not rewarding people with the independence to practice in certain settings without actually having the license. So I definitely support the 8 years. I know people in particular who they are taking the test. They're just having a very, very, very difficult time passing for whatever reason. They just maybe don't do very well with that type of testing modality, and so maybe the 2 extra years would help them. But I think limiting the number of registrations is critical, one, so that we are pushing people to actually do everything in their power to get licensed. Yes. And then two, we're not, and then I think also limiting their capacity to function or work in private practice settings after that first registration is important, because once again, we don't want to reward people who are not pursuing or getting licensed to work in independent settings, because I don't think that was the intention of the law either. They wanted people who were licensed to work under their own license to be in those significantly or highly independent settings. So,
Go ahead.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Carl Peralta, Board of Behavioral Sciences. My position is actually lead LMFT evaluator for this board, for the board. I'm listening to this wonderful discussion about competency and, 8-year versus 6-year and stuff like that. If you don't mind, I'd like to change tack and bring up another issue from my perspective that is of concern to me. And I haven't seen it addressed in this proposal. So there's this concept, there's this idea of extending the registration from 6 years to 8 years for a variety of reasons. Understood, to allow for more opportunity in private practice as well as exempt settings, and to allow people to who've had hardships of various degrees. And I've talked to these people. Some people have had extreme hardships, and I understand that. What I haven't seen in this proposal, I'm just kind of curious what this committee thinks about it, is the proposal currently is to potentially extend the registration to 8 years. What does that do to the 6-year rule, though? So if the intention is to allow people to earn hours over a period of 8 years, but we still have law on the books that says we can only accept the most recent 6 years of experience, then to me it seems like a disconnect. And so
We would have to align, I think, both of those.
Right, we're going to get to that. That's actually
Yeah,
the next discussion item, so we're going to
That's
get to
actually
that.
right
So you're
there.
right on point, so that's
Yes.
perfect to bring it up. So yeah, we'll be discussing that next.
That is exactly the next question. And we're just kind of wrapping it up, because it's so interrelated.
can I make one more point, though?
Yeah,
Well, I have one more thought, and I want to thank that gentleman for that comment.
yeah.
So you made a point earlier, which I wholeheartedly agree with. If we move this to 8 years and then allow people to have subsequent registrations, theoretically, someone has been in the field 16 years and are not licensed. I'm wondering if it might be better if we're going to look at limiting registrations to leave it at 6 and allow them to have a subsequent registration, and then after that consider not allowing anymore, because then that's at least 12 years, and that's a little bit more palatable than someone being in the field 16 years. Theoretically, someone could work their whole career, retire, and never have pursued sort of or actually obtained their license. So maybe something else to consider is to leave it like it is and limit it to 2 6-year registrations, and then look at that point, not offering another one unless they go back to school and get another degree, because that is at least 12 years. And to me, that's extremely fair versus 16, which seems excessive.
So we could do like a 6-year, then that ends, you take 36 hours, renew, you can work in any setting, and you get another 6 years, and then
Not any setting. I mean, my suggestion still would be that they couldn't work in private practice, because once again, you don't want to reward people for not having had their license. That's my thought.
Then that's not going to help the people that I'm thinking of that just need a little bit more time to get there. I think the point is well taken. 16 years is a long time, but I think we're penalizing the very people that we're trying to help by extending it out to 8 years. So maybe we take this back to the exempt committee and have a substantive, I'm still in support of the original 8 years. The question is, if we're going to expand that out, how much should we expand it out, and should we limit the settings at that point? I could certainly see that. I could support saying, okay, after your 8 years, you're out of private practice. You need to find another place to practice. I could get behind that. And it may be that a subsequent registration maybe shouldn't be for a full 8 years.
Should be
It
shorter.
maybe should be less.
Yes.
Maybe it should be 4 years, because that ultimately is going to add up to the same 12. But I don't want to penalize that small population of people who are in fact working in private practice and just have had life circumstances that have made it so that they either can't pass the test, haven't passed the test, or haven't been able to get their hours.
Right. Christine?
Yeah, I just want to make the comment that I like the idea of 8 hours because even though this isn't even my profession, I can't even tell you how many people I've talked to who said, I just can't get my hours in 6 years. And they're trying and they are working several jobs. And so I really do support that. Yeah.
And I think that's also the, if we want to encourage them to get their hours by limiting their setting or not changing, the current rules, that is not conducive. So, we want to keep them current. We want them to, to get the hours. So I think there are different options that we can play around, whether extending the hours, limit the subsequent number, doing the continuing education or whatever. So I think there's definitely that we can have, I would love to hear the feedback from actually the stakeholders, because I think this is something very, very real. There's some people just cannot get through that. So, I want to know, what will be a reasonable timeline. So Steve and then Roseanne.
Can I make a suggestion? And instead of, let's maybe think about getting rid of the term subsequent license and registration, looking at what we think is an appropriate amount of time, and then figuring out, if you have to come back in and apply for another registration number, what are the rules surrounding that? Because I think having that subsequent, if we're trying to make things easier to understand, more, equitable and everything, it's a license. We don't have a subsequent LMFT license. It should just be treated as a license. And then that's what it is for 10 years. You can have and renew that, or 8 years, whatever. And then from there, then we used to have the conversation of what do we do then? Looking at the language for getting an associate license, making sure we have the language in there. You have to have the current education. If not, then you might have to make up current, instead of subsequents, because I think that causes a lot of confusion.
See, there's another option. Roseanne?
The only thought I have about limiting somebody to just one additional registration number is that would it create an inequity across the license types? Because we have LCSW that's changed from 48 to 60 is kind of the standard. MFT changed a little bit longer ago. But then we have social work that it's more of as long as your degree is accredited, there's not a specific number of units that is specified. Would that give certain license types that haven't changed as much over time an advantage where it's maybe if I'm this license type, I can just get right back in with my education, whereas if I'm an LPCC, I have to go get a whole new degree. And how do we mitigate for that?
Yes. And then oftentimes, when those people who have to reapply, then, when you think about 16 years has passed, that the degree will be outdated, so there, I think, there are a lot of the moving pieces, when you say 8 years, 6 years, renewable, not renewable, that kind of stuff. So, Christine.
I hadn't thought of it before, but I kind of do like Steve's suggestion. Just think of the appropriate amount of time and that's it. Because we've already talked about it, 12 years, 16 years, maybe it's 10, whatever it is, just one. This is how long you have.
Right.
Get it done, get your license.
Right.
I don't know. It's just a thought. I kind of like it.
I would want to know, though, if we can legally do that.
Then there's that.
I don't know if there's precedent. If any other boards have something like that, how do?
Can I just make one thing and then?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't even know if it's quite the same. A lawyer could probably has, but in my profession, you have a limited permit, one. That's it, and then you've got to pass the boards and get your full licensure. You don't get to renew it, so I don't know.
What happens if you don't get your license? What happens if you don't?
You can't practice. Yeah, you cannot practice, you have to stop practicing until you pass the boards and all that. But it's not quite the same because it's not the hour situation. So I guess it's not exactly the same, but it's a similar setup. It's a certain limited license until, got to get some things done in that time.
But the expectation and my guess is the rationale for that is that they want you licensed. And so whatever
Yes.
whether it's hours, time frame, whatever, the goal is that they want you licensed.
Correct, yes.
That
And if you,
process is.
yeah, and if you can't get it done, you just wait till you can get it done.
Well, I think we could include some research and survey of other boards in with, as we put it back to the committee, and that gives us a little bit of time to get some correct information.
Christy?
I like the idea as well. There is a lot of confusion about subsequent numbers. And then we wouldn't have to worry about defining private practice yet again. It's just one in, maybe it's 10 years and that's it. The one thing is to keep in mind, how is this going to fly at the legislature? The problem is with these professions, unfortunately, what's happened is these registrations are in some settings are being used in a way they're not intended for. So there are populations out there, I think they're all in exempt settings for the most part, that are perpetual interns, and that's how that way those settings can get Medi-Cal reimbursement. So there might be workforce issues we need to think about, but to me, in concept, that's not what they were originally intended for. But just to think about how we could structure this in a way that will fly.
Absolutely.
It's there.
Absolutely. Public comments? Thanks for waiting patiently. Hi, Kenneth.
Yes, hello, Kenneth from California Association for LPCC. I just recently had a conversation with a member about the 6-year requirement, and just life instances happen, and the populations that we need to sort of attract to the profession just cannot work a job, a regular paying job, have an internship, take classes, study for the test, all of those things. So 8 years we think is a really good number for that. I also support the same idea with why have all of these subsequent things. There's a limited amount of time. That's a fair amount of time, we believe, and I think that's a very good idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Hi, Angela.
Good morning, Angela Blanchard on behalf of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. We too agree with the comments just stated and in general feel like 1 or 2 additional years on top of the 6 is appropriate. There is some sentiment within CAMP that, we want to obviously continue consumer protections and consumer safety and, looking at what that hard line could be in terms of a cutoff. So those are our comments for now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Rebecca Gonzalez, National Association of Social Workers, California Chapter. I don't believe we've had, a large number of our members contact us and say that the 6 years isn't sufficient, but we have heard it before. And one way that it's a little bit unique to social work, and I'm thinking of a particular comment right now, is someone who was involved in macro social work, but still really wanted to get her LCSW. So, her day job, her demanding day job was not any kind of setting where you can get hours. And so I know she had requested. So I just wanted to make you think of another population that might have a difficulty obtaining their hours in 6 years.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful. So I think that, defer the discussion, again, tweak it, maybe, have the discussion at the, reviving exam setting committee. I think it will be a good place to talk about. Yes, Christine?
Who is on our exempt setting committee?
The previous members are Betty, me, and Deborah.
Okay, so everybody's still around. Okay, I'm just curious.
But you can appoint anybody.
I would recommend, and I was going to actually take this forward afterwards, that we add one of our licensees, like an LMFT, to the exempt committee, because I think it's important to, I looked at our committee at times and thought it would be nice to have an additional license represented. LEPs don't struggle with this in the same way. It's really not as relevant. So I would love to see us expand the committee by at least one member.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the board chair's pleasure.
Yes, of course.
You can appoint anybody you want.
And I mean, I think, I'm all in support of public members. I am a public member, but I think for a committee like this, it's so technical. I think it's so important to have licensees on that committee. So
I do
agree
too.
with that, yeah.
I agree, yeah. Thank you so much. So we quickly touch on, the 15 units semester unit, and we haven't really talked about, the 6 years age of experience hours. But I think, Roseanne, you're about to say something.
I would recommend that this is obviously has to be addressed. We might be a little bit early. I would think that my preference for simplicity would be that it follows whatever whatever number of years of the registration we settle on, because it's clean. Then somebody doesn't have to worry about, I've got my 8-year registration, but now my hours are starting to expire. So
I would agree.
Yeah.
I would agree.
So I want to thank everybody. Wonderful discussion and so many different options, to consider. So it's better, to have the input, from everybody.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for the public comments also. Okay.
we'll
so
go back and tweak
We'll be
and
back.
meet.
Stay tuned for this topic. We'll be back later. So let's move on to the next one, and that's the regulations to implement AB 2138. And Roseanne, you're on again.
Yes, okay. So AB 2138 made significant changes to the board's enforcement process, and the bill was signed at the end of September. It becomes effective on July 1, 2020, so it has a little bit of a delayed implementation, 1.5 years. Key provisions, I'll summarize some of the key provisions. It only permits a board to deny a license on a ground that an applicant has been convicted of a crime or has been subject to formal discipline if either of these two things are met. The conviction was within 7 years of the date the application was made and is substantially related to the qualifications, functions, or duties of the profession. However, the 7-year limit doesn't apply if the conviction was for a serious felony or for certain people who have to register as a sex offender. And the other limitation is the applicant has been subject to formal discipline by the licensing board within the past 7 years. Then we could deny if it was for professional misconduct that would be substantially related to the profession. The bill also prohibits a board from requiring an applicant for license or disclose information about their criminal history. The board is permitted to request it for determining substantial relationship or evidence of rehabilitation, but they are not required to, and they have to be informed that the disclosure is voluntary. And then it requires each board to develop some criteria to determine whether a crime is substantially related to the qualifications, functions, and duties of the profession. And that has to include 3 things specified by law: the nature and gravity of the offense, the number of years elapsed, and the nature of the duties of the profession. The board cannot deny a license based on a conviction without considering evidence of rehabilitation. And we have to develop criteria to evaluate rehabilitation when considering denying, suspending, or revoking a license. It has to be that a showing of rehabilitation shall be considered if the person has completed their criminal sentence without a violation of parole or probation, or if the board otherwise finds its criteria for rehabilitation has been met. So we have in our current regulations, we have a substantial relationship criteria and criteria for rehabilitation already. However, with the new requirements of this bill, we have to beef that up a little bit. And so what has been happening is that DCA Legal has been reviewing the bill, and they put forth a memo to boards basically outlining some suggestions of what the law should look like based on the reading of the bill. So we've had that information. We've had some discussions with the boards about how to craft the language. Each board is a little different, so each board's going to vary a little, but we're trying. The goal is sort of to keep everybody in compliance with the law, and because 40 regulation packages are going to have to go through at the same time and need to be in place by July 1, 2020 to try to keep them as similar as possible to ensure compliance with the law and to ensure that they get passed. So we've made some amendments. We've shown the language is attached. We have some changes to the substantial relationship criteria, which is section 1812. We've brought in professional misconduct in that criteria because AB 2138 includes that as an option. Also in section 1812, we've specified the requirements that the law requires in there. We have to consider the nature and gravity of the offense, the number of years, and the nature of duties of the profession. We have also added language that substantially related crimes include but are not limited to violations of some certain provisions of the code that cover things like rebates, refunds, and false advertising, and then also any violations of the board's practice acts. So that's kind of something that we decided to put in there as well. Excuse me. In terms of criteria for rehabilitation, we've updated those. We have 1813, which is criteria for denial of licensure, and 1814 is for criteria for denial of suspensions or revocations. We've expanded that based on the requirements of the bill and upon guidance from DCA legal. And then we had to make some tweaks to our uniform standards and disciplinary guidelines. Those are incorporated by reference via Section 1888 of the regulations, and a portion of the uniform standards actually details the board's criteria for rehabilitation, which AB 2138 updated, so it's out of date. So we basically had to strike that language. It's shown on page 125 of your packet. We had to strike that language and basically include a reference to law to just make sure that it stays current from now on. Unfortunately, because that has to happen, we were currently trying to run regulations to update the uniform standards and disciplinary guidelines. It was our enforcement process regulations was the title. It was pretty significant and extensive changes. We had submitted it to the DCA legal for initial review process in July of 2017. And it had gone through review of DCA at DCA and agency. But unfortunately, now we have to place that on hold because that's a very significant proposal. And we have to run this proposal and have it in place by July 1, 2020. So kind of a tough decision, but it's one that had to be made to get this through. And so you can see that that change was made. And then finally, required actions against registered sex offenders. The bill permits denial of a license for sex crimes that require certain registrations under Section 290D 2 or 3. There's a little bit of unclarity in AB 2138 about that the penal code it references has a delayed implementation date of 2021. So legal's currently looking at that and trying to get that squared away. But for now, we're proposing to amend that section as well. It's a kind of a generic blanket statement so that it can continue on with the way the law is. So that is all I have for you and all I will let you discuss.
So we're basically trying to change the language to, prepare for the implementation. So, so there's, concept-wise, there's not a whole lot that we can do. It's really about the languages, in the text.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, and I will say that, Sabina has been a tremendous help in this, and Roseanne as well, in crafting it, the language, so that the board is able to retain discretion when it comes to, those that have prior criminal convictions and such. And so I think this strikes a very nice balance between the requirements of the law and our role to protect consumers.
Right.
So,
yeah, it looks really good to me.
yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Yes. Yeah, it looks fine with me. So, board members, any comments? No? Okay, public comments.
Hello, Rebecca Gonzalez, National Association of Social Workers, California chapters. As you know, we were involved with a variety of groups. It was a big coalition of groups that worked on AB 2138 with our primary goal of the thought that we know there are many social workers out there, social work students that came from foster care perhaps, or came from communities that were challenged economically. And so they do have a past criminal record, but they have gone on from that. They've gotten their master's degree, and they are applying for licensure. So we just wanted to make the process a little smoother for them. So that was, that has been our goal. So I talked to a few members of the coalition, so I have questions about a few of the changes based on the language that you wrote. And the first one is a technical question that you could tell is not my question. It was a lawyer's question. So in section 1812, substantial criteria, and then at the bottom where you have the note, the authority cited, you mention section 4892. And they were saying that has not been amended, and they're concerned that there could be a conflict because 4982 says irrespective of an order under 1203.4. And 1203.4 dismissals are very important to people who fall in the 7-year serious felony 290 range. The person who made the suggestion said he really kind of wanted to look in this a little more and dig in a little bit more, but I wanted to raise that to see if you see that as something that needs to be examined more, and if there is a conflict there.
So 4982 is an unprofessional conduct provision for MFT. We do need to clean that up next year. Once the bill comes into effect, there are some provisions that need to change. I'm not sure that we can take that out. Is that it's already in that regulation section as a related section.
You mean that note was already there?
Yeah, it's not being added.
Okay.
It's because we're amending the existing section, and it was already a reference, so I don't know that we could justify taking it out.
I don't know that we can.
Do you see that, though, as a valid kind of concern, something that might be a conflict that needs to be looked into more?
I don't think so, because we're going to have to, we already know we're going to have to amend section 4982.
Because of 2138?
Because of 2138, yes. So that's going to come next year once it goes into effect. And right now, the language in 2138 is notwithstanding any other law, so it already overrides anything in 4982 that may need to be removed. So I think that we're okay. Do you agree with that? Okay.
Yeah, it'll come secondary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then another section, the next section, 1813, criteria for rehabilitation, denial of licensure. And this is the section where you're talking about probation and the length of probation. And so their comment was, this section goes on about the length of the sentence and if it was modified, et cetera. And the way or the purpose of the bill, and I think I was looking at, let's see what section this is. In section 4, if I'm doing the right part, 480 under 2B.
Which part you're referring to?
She's looking at page 132.
132, okay.
Sorry about that, I'm looking at a printout.
Okay.
Section B, notwithstanding any other provision of this code, a person shall not be denied a license on the basis that he or she has been convicted of a crime or on the basis of acts underlining a conviction for a crime if he or she has obtained a certificate of rehabilitation, and then it has some citations, has been granted clemency or a pardon by a state or federal executive, or has made a showing of rehabilitation pursuant to section 482. So the thought is, what was the purpose for all of this criteria that the bill is really pretty clear on that. It just is pertaining if they have a pardon or if they have a certificate of rehabilitation, and adding the sections are about, was a parole shortened or lengthened, terms and conditions of parole or probation, that the point is just that they did complete and they fulfilled their duty, once they were, they served their sentence, if there was a sentence, and they served all the conditions that were placed upon them by the court. Why we're adding extra criteria to look at, modifications, et cetera, when the bill or the intent of the bill seems to be just that they have completed their parole or they have obtained a certificate of rehabilitation.
I couldn't even figure out what section B should be because it doesn't match mine.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that was like one section I thought. I don't know if it's the correct one that I'm pulling out, or there's one before that.
I think 480 tells us that we need to specify the criteria, and that's what we did.
I think because it says solely on, I think that's why regulations have to clarify, interpret, and make more specific statutes.
So the word solely is still there. And then
in my book it is, but I don't know.
Right.
Roseanne, if this is the most current in here.
Right.
I'm assuming.
The bill, yes.
Chaptered.
Right.
Yes, it was chaptered. That's the most current version.
And so one of the concerns that have been raised in this group, since most of these people represent, folks who don't have financial means, is that sometimes the way you could show rehabilitation is, AA meetings, classes, all these kinds of things that cost money, and those are the people that they represent. And so that's why it's really a concern. They feel like it's really hard for people to, be able to show more than the fact that they actually met what the court had required.
Well, that's exactly what we look at when we get the information. I mean, there is what the court mandates that individual to do, and then we also take into consideration what they're doing on their own. Are they active in their community? Are they supportive? Do we have good letters of recommendation? So honestly, I'll be very just frank with you. The stuff that we're listing here, that's what we already do. It's just now out there in front.
Right.
And so we consider all of that. Somebody who's had a prior conviction, they've gone on and gotten a master's degree, we look at the GPA, everything. But 2138 mandated that we put everything out there for transparency.
Right.
So no, solely we can't deny on a particular conviction.
Right.
But if it's a violation or considered substantially related to the practice and our Practice Act, then we still have that authority to consider denial or issuance.
So yeah, I guess the feeling of the group was that it was excessive going beyond just whether they met the conditions of parole or obtain a certificate of rehabilitation.
Well, I don't know where the only one certificate of rehabilitation I've ever seen is somebody that got it after serving prison. So that's the only thing I have ever seen. I don't know if it exists to get it anywhere else. So, and the expungement is, I guess, maybe in lieu of that. But, when you're thinking, I've seen some sex crimes dismissed under 1203.4. That is clearly related, especially when you think about putting that therapist or counselor or social worker in a closed room, or in a room with a closed door with a minor or, the victim of the assault, the same gender. So that is substantially related, and I think we would be remiss in our public protection mandate to not consider that. I would be open to hearing how that person was rehabilitated. I'd like to see what has happened, but to say just because I got that gives me a pass, I don't know that that's clearly what the legislature intended.
Although aren't the sex crimes already outside of
Some
this?
are,
Yeah.
but not all. Some are and some not. And we just had one that recently, they just pled it down. But when you get into the underlying facts of the case, it's really concerning. I would not want that individual in a room with any gender or any age.
So just to, also just to read a little bit more about what this person said. I would like the board to find that a person is rehabilitated when the individual has completed the sentence at hand with no violations and wondered why the length of probation matters. That is a standard practice by the court and is not set based on unique circumstances in many cases.
Trying to think how best to respond on that. One of the things that we look at is many times someone has just made a real stellar showing and has had probation terminated early. That's great. That's great rehab. That speaks volumes to that individual's character. Opposite of that is someone who's continually in violation of probe. They're forgetting to turn in the required documentation. They're not on time with their payments. And sometimes they have a subsequent arrest, which extends their probation. So if you look at everything in sum total, that gives you a bigger picture of that individual as opposed to, well, I finished this, I'm good. So the law's not saying that because you finished probation with the court that you get the automatic pass. That's not, and I can see where they might desire that, but that's not what this bill did.
So I'm just going to, I'm not expecting you to solve this problem right here, but I just wanted to bring it up. And I hope it's something that's solved by the legislature or changed by the legislature at some future date, is that, and I think we've all heard about this circumstance more and more, these technical violations of probation that get people caught up, and it just further adds to their inability to move on once they have completed their sentence. And, you know, people who don't have the means, reliable transportation, missing their appointments. I also went to a legislative hearing more recently with a social worker who had her child had mental health issues. Actually, it wasn't mental health issues, it was disability, learning disability issues. And no matter how much she worked with him, it was really hard to keep him on point and on task. And he did have a criminal record, but actually making those appointments and getting there on time was just a real challenge. So like I said, I know that's not what you guys are going to do today, but I do think that there's sometimes extenuating circumstances why people have these technical violations.
Absolutely.
And that whole process has gotten out of hand. And so I think that's probably part of the frustration here.
Okay.
So I think the other two minor points, let's see, looking at your outline, Roseanne, with your language under 1814, criteria for rehabilitation. So I'm on page 83 now. And then, so page 83, number 5, although it looks like there's a number 5 at the top of the page, the one in the middle of the page, the criteria in subdivision A15 as applicable. And then number 7, evidence of any concerning the degree to which a false statement relative to application for licensure may have been unintentional, inadvertent, or immaterial. And I think they were wondering how the expunged sentences fit into here, into that part.
What do you mean how they fit?
He just wrote PC section 1203.4, 1203.4A, 1203.41, 1203.42, certificate of rehabilitation, pardon, or comparable dismissal.
I think the ones you just read pertain to a false statement.
Okay.
So they would
So
have-
maybe he might have thought that they're
and that's not new either.
clarification of what you're referring to here.
These are
Old languages,
this is already in there.
original text.
But it's merely that somebody made a false statement, knowing, unintentionally, inadvertently, or if it's an immaterial false statement.
I could get clarification on that one of what they wanted. And then, and I was going to be disclosed. And then in number 8, where you say efforts made by the applicant either to correct a false statement once made on an application or to conceal the truth concerning facts required to be disclosed. And I think they wondered how that jived with the requirement to not require self-disclosure.
Then that wouldn't apply. If disclosure is voluntary, then that wouldn't be something that was required to be disclosed.
Okay.
Right.
Is there anything that needs to be clarified there, do you think, in the language?
I don't
Yeah.
think so. Those, because,
Those are existing.
Yeah.
yeah, those are existing provisions, so there is something that talks about taking action on a false statement in 480, but I don't think that it affects that there. On page 133 of the packet E, a board may deny a license regulated by this, that the applicant knowingly made a false statement of fact and is required to be revealed. We cannot deny solely on the applicant's failure to disclose that fact that would not been cause for denial. So it is permitted, and so this is basically if we have a false statement, it's allowing, let me get back to the language here, us to consider if we have a false statement that's part of the whole situation, we can consider that if, oh, well, they made a false statement, but it was unintentional and they corrected it, so no problem. So
Right.
it allows that.
Okay.
A good example on that, Rebecca, is a lot of times now what happens is because they've gotten the 1203.4 dismissal, some attorneys will tell them you don't need to disclose that. And so they don't, because that's the advice that they got. We penalize nobody for that. I mean, we just contact them and say, we noticed this, we received information about this, you didn't mention it in your application.
Right.
Please provide a response. So, and in that situation, it would, we would, that's an effort. I mean, I'm sorry, this is what I was told. We understand that.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I think that must happen quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of.
Yeah, there's a
confusion
lot of
there.
misinformation. I mean, yeah, I think for a job application, you're not required, but I do know that there's a law in the book that does require you to disclose it.
Right. And then a couple of questions just that I had from somebody else, even though I think that I know the answer to this. Will you be requiring criminal history disclosure, although I know it's voluntary disclosure, and documentation for histories older and within the 7 years of application date?
I would say it depends.
It depends.
Yeah,
So-
it depends. It's because they're being printed, we're going to see it.
Right.
They're going to see it. And if I see an extensive history, and they're out there of habitual arrests and convictions for drug use, under the influence, selling, theft, and you've got all of that up until that 7-year benchmark, and then you're good for a couple of years, and then it reoccurs, that's a concern. It doesn't mean that that person won't get a license, it's just a concern. So I think moving forward, even though they're not required, having information, all the information so that we can make an informed decision is probably recommended.
Yeah. And then let me see. And then I think this person had some of the same concerns about the rehabilitation language, and somebody else who had the same concerns about the parole or the completion of parole or probation. But I think I don't know where, I know this still has to go before the board, but since these just came out a little while ago, if I have more recommendations for changes in the language, would want to come back at the board meeting and talk to you about that.
Yeah, I mean, from this point, I mean, if the committee likes it as it is right now, then the next step will be at the board meeting at the end of the month.
Right.
And then we get to go through the reg process.
Oh, fun.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I do appreciate it. And I do appreciate how the board carefully evaluates these applications. I know you do you're thoughtful, you're very thoughtful about your evaluations, but that there's just a lot of frustration out there that people who do really want to become social workers or other professionals, they want to move on, they feel like they made a mistake in their youth and they're continually defined by that mistake. And they think that there's a point in time where they don't need to be defined by their past. And so, just expressing some of those frustrations.
Becca.
Thank you so much. So, any other comments from the public, from the board members? Okay, so I need a motion for this recommendation. Oh, have you? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Motion?
Yeah, I need a motion. The motion is recommend to, it's right there under recommendation.
Direct staff to make any discussed changes as well as any non-substantive changes and bring to the board for consideration as a regulatory proposal.
I make a recommendation that we direct staff to make any discussed changes as well as any non-substantive changes and bring to the board for consideration as a regulatory proposal.
I'll second that. Okay, any other discussion? Okay, we're ready for vote.
Okay, Jonathan Maddox,
Yes.
Christina Wong,
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlis. Yes. Betty Conley,
Yes.
motion carries.
Thank you so much. So the next agenda item is the legislative update. Roseanne, please.
Yes, so it's that time of year again. We've gone bills. Kim and I spent some lovely afternoons at the Capitol bill shopping to get authors for our bill proposals. So we have 3 legislative proposals that we're pursuing this year. We have our license portability bill that represents the work of the board's license portability and creates a pathway for licensees actively licensed in another state to have a little bit of a smoother process. We have found an author for that bill. Expect it to be in Ledge Council is still drafting the finalized language, expecting it to be introduced around the February 22nd introduction deadline for that one. We will be bringing the Ledge Council language back to the board in March. Ledge Council had a couple of tweaks that are a little bit substantive. One of the tweaks that they noticed is that for LMFTs and LPCCs, we allow the law states the degree can be a master's or doctoral, and for LCSWs, it only says master's, and it's been that way for quite some time. So they suggested that we add doctoral, and we've run that by Rebecca and Jan Lee, and Ledge Council's drafting that with that included, but we need to bring it back to the board. We didn't have that covered. So the next bill is the required notice to consumers for psychotherapy services. We have found an author for that bill as well. And that bill, it should either be introduced today or sometime early next week. The author's office is getting close to being ready to introduce it. And then finally, our omnibus legislation, that's always run through the Senate Business and Professions Committee, and we've submitted that proposal to them for consideration.
Thank you so much. This is exciting, that knowing that it's a signed number and it's in that legislative cycle. Okay, thanks, Roseanne. And so the next agenda item is the status of board rulemaking proposals, and it's Christy.
Thank you. So the first one here is the enforcement process, which is updating the uniform standards and disciplinary guidelines. That's the one Roseanne just talked about that's on hold as we process the AB 2138 regs. The second one has to do with examiner scoring, application abandonment, and a subsequent registration fee. And so that proposal was approved by the board in November 2017, began the DCA initial review process in April 2018, and was approved through that DCA process on January 11th. So I'm actually getting ready to turn that into OAL for notice next week. So that is in process. And then we are also preparing the supervision regulations that we were holding pending passage of AB 93 to begin the DCA initial review process. It's a lot we had to really wait for the bill to pass, so that language was completely final because everything rolls off of that, and there's a lot to this proposal, so it's going to take us a little time to get it into initial review, but we're working hard to do that as quickly as we can. And that's it.
So we're making tiny little bit progress. We're moving very slowly forward. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Christy. So any questions or no? Okay. So the next one is public comments for items not on the agenda. Any public comments? Okay. The next one is the suggestions for future agenda items. Any suggestions? No, don't see any. Great. So it's the favorite time of the meeting. It's the adjournment. So 12:02 p.m. Thank you very much for attending the meeting. We're adjourned now.
Thank you, everybody.